In the Viscount's house, everyone sat down because a ball was to be held, which was hosted by Duke Metellio himself. The madam and her daughter discussed the upcoming holiday. The young lady looked at her mother intently and said with a smile that the Duke was a wonderful gentleman. Madame smiled and said that he, as the most inveterate bachelor in high society, should interest her. Everyone was looking forward to the holiday except for one person, the youngest daughter of the family, Adette Bears. The young lady sighed heavily, as she did not want to go anywhere at all. She knew that her sister would be better suited for the Duke. The lady said that she was worried about her daughter, as she had not received a single offer for a long period of time. The madam looked closely at her daughter and said that she should get married this year. The young lady, in turn, fell to the ground. Everyone rushed towards her with the speed of lightning. Viola looked at her mother and said that her sister was worried. Adette knew that her sister was just an angel. The lady was shocked. She did not expect this, because she knew that her daughter could miss a great opportunity. A moment later, she actually started coughing very hard. The madam told the assistant to call the doctor and give the young lady some rest. As she was leaving, Madame called her daughter as they were already late. Sasha looked at her sister and asked if she was okay. Lady said that she just needed some rest alone. The young man was puzzled, as he understood that this situation was not pleasant. The young lady, in turn, quickly took off her exquisite outfit and changed her clothes. She hoped that such an outfit would be enough. He looked closely at the lady and said that Madame was still here and he was worried that they might meet by chance. She said that they had to take a risk. The young man sighed heavily and said that this time he had a bad feeling. She looked at him intently and thanked him with a smile, but still said that if they wanted to provide for their family, they had no choice. She smiled and said that she was surprised. "This disguise is very convenient." The young lady said with a smile that this time she would definitely get the Duke's consent. This life. Her fifth reincarnation. She clearly remembered her past lives from birth itself. Her past life seemed to her like a curse in which she lived for almost 30 years. She sighed heavily, for she knew that fortune had always had its back on her. But in this life, she was born a noblewoman. She thought that she would enjoy a carefree life. But unfortunately, the young lady was not lucky this time either. Approaching the residence, she was furious because the line was very long. The young man told his companion that they would only reach the estate in an hour. The young lady froze in shock as she did not expect to have to wait for so long. She felt that the Duke's estate was on the same level as the imperial palace. She wondered how much the gardener who did all the work earned. She froze for a moment as she realized that on the day of the ball, the open garden was a secret meeting place for lovers. She realized that she needed to go back before anyone noticed her. But a moment later, the young lady unexpectedly collided with someone. She froze in place, not understanding what had happened. She froze when she realized who she had run into. The young man smiled and called out to the Viscount. The young lady was shocked, as she realized that the Duke himself was standing in front of her. Taken aback, she stepped back and accidentally tripped. But a moment later, he caught her with ease. The Duke looked at her intently and said with a smile that he had saved her. He smiled and greeted the Viscount. The young lady froze in embarrassment. But a moment later, they heard obscene sounds from afar. The Duke accidentally dropped the young lady on the ground and she fell with a crash. He worriedly asked the Viscount if everything was okay with him. Morris looked closely at the young lady and asked her to slow down a little and not to push herself. She sighed heavily and said that if she didn't do this, he would have more work. He looked at the lady and said that the Duke had rejected her offer. She asked in surprise if he had accepted investment rates lower than theirs. The young man hesitated, not knowing what to answer. The young lady looked at the assistant intently with bewilderment. Morris said the Duke conveyed that he did not need the woman's investor's help. The young lady was furious. She wondered if he had rejected her proposal just because she was a woman. She knew that in this world, women rarely made money. Everyone said that a beautiful woman just needs to get married well. A woman had to find herself a husband who would provide her with a luxurious life. Everyone said that making money was not a woman's job. She was furious and thought it was just ridiculous. After some thought, the young lady came up with a brilliant idea. She called her assistant. She said that he should send the Duke another offer of investment. He was surprised because they were refused. She said he should send the proposal on behalf of her maternal uncle, Viscount Tarusev. Her grandfather had only one daughter. After his death, no one could continue the Viscount's line. She knew that if she were a man, she would have inherited the title. Morris excitedly asked the young lady if her plan would work. Adette S. said that no matter what happens, they must complete this investment deal. She said that her sister would soon get married, and for Sasha's successful debut, a lot of money would be needed. She said that her mother would never allow her sister to marry an ordinary man, and the larger her dowry, the better. Adette was shocked because she realized that the life of a noblewoman required much more money than she thought. There were only a few maritime-related businesses in the kingdom. A year ago, the Duke announced his intention to found a company to build huge ships and began attracting investors. The young lady knew that this was a very profitable business and she needed to take it up. She knew she had to invest in this business by any means necessary. The Duke read the Viscount's proposal. He was surprised as he had not heard the name given before. The Duke said with a grin that it was very funny and that he needed to meet the Viscount in person. The Duke wrote to the Viscount that he would like to meet in person and discuss the details. The young lady was shocked when she read this letter from the Duke. Morris looked hard at the young lady and asked what they should do. He said he couldn't go because his face might already be remembered. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she would send a letter to meet him. He looked at her intently and asked if everything would be okay after the meeting. She sighed heavily and said that if it was revealed that the Viscount was a woman, she would be refused again. But if she did not meet, she would again arouse suspicion. On the day of the meeting with the Duke, Morris froze in surprise and screamed as he called out to the young lady. He looked at her in surprise and asked if this was the only way out. He shouted at her that it was dangerous because she could get caught. She said that she had already gone out in the street like that before, and no one noticed that she was a woman. He quickly realized she was right. But a moment later, he shouted that that wasn't the problem. He shouted that the Duke was shrewd, and he was not a fool like the rest. She wondered what she should do in this situation. She looked at her assistant and told him the situation. He apologized for not being able to find a replacement. She smiled and asked if there was a worthy person who could help her in this situation. He sighed heavily and asked her to be careful, as the Duke might draw his sword. She smiled and asked what he was talking about. He shouted that she should be on guard. She smiled and said that if the Duke killed her, he should take care of her family. The young man was shocked. The king of the state is very old, and for this reason the crown prince is responsible for state affairs. And his brother, without being present in person, led the army to victory and strengthened his position politically. The young lady entered the estate and looked at it closely. She knew that the knight who had contributed most to the victory was Duke Ben Galisker Cade Metellio. The young lady entered the room and looked intently at the Duke. He greeted her with a smile. She smiled and said that she was very honored to be here. She introduced herself as Viscount Tarusaf. The Duke looked at her closely after shaking her hands. He said that he had not heard of the Viscount before. She said it was all because their family was on the verge of collapse. The Duke asked where they got so much money. She said that it was left by her cousin's deceased husband. The Duke asked the Viscount with a smile if he knew her sister, and she became nervous. The young lady froze in place and wondered if he knew about their family. She knew that if he lied, things would get more complicated. Adette sighed heavily and said that her sister's name was Viscountess Bears. The Duke said with a grin that he knew about her family. The young lady froze in place in surprise. She did not know what to answer. He smiled and said that the Viscountess was a beautiful woman, and all her daughters were beauties, and they said that the eldest was very smart. He said that the eldest was not as beautiful as her younger sisters, but she was said to be quite smart. She was shocked as he knew about her. She smiled and said that she had not seen her nieces for a long time. She noticed that the Duke was very interested in them. He smiled and said that he would like to meet the young lady one day. She stood frozen in place, not knowing what to answer. Looking at the Duke, she said that even if the girl was a genius, she was still a woman. She said that since ancient times, a woman only needs to get married using her beauty. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he thought differently. And although the Viscount's family had no man, the eldest daughter was managing very well. He smiled and said with a grin that he was very interested in it. In this world, everyone liked beautiful women more than smart women. From a young age, it was natural that her younger sisters received more attention than she did. The Duke surprised her greatly with his words. The Duke asked if there was any reason why the Viscount wanted to invest in their business. The Duke asked if it was all because of Lady Bears. Adette was taken aback and cried out that it was not so. She knew she had to get her act together quickly and make this investment a reality. She looked hard at the Duke and said she believed in the value of shipping. She said that their country had achieved significant growth on the continent, so a new era would certainly begin soon. She said that at times like these, large and reliable ships are most needed. She looked at the Duke intently and said that she would like to go into the Duke's business of building iterative ships. He asked if she wouldn't have invested if it weren't his business. He was curious why that was, since she loved the sea so much. She said that building ships is a complex business, and ships require time and money, and also advanced technology. She looked at the Duke and said that this was not something that everyone could do. The Duke smiled and said that this was very interesting, as he had not met a man like the Viscount for a long time. The young lady wondered if this was a compliment. She looked at him closely and thought that the rumors were definitely true, since the Duke was handsome. She asked if she could find out something from him. He said that she could ask, but he would decide whether to answer or not. She asked why he was attracting investors if he could handle everything himself. He looked intently at the young lady and said that this project was state-owned. She looked at him in bewilderment. A moment later, she realized what was going on, that building ships was an attractive business. But since it could become a weapon against the royal family, if the Duke continues alone, he could face scrutiny from the royal family. She said that she understood everything. The Duke smiled and told the Viscount that he grasped everything on the fly. The Duke told the Viscount with a smile that if he didn't mind, he would like to meet again. The young lady looked at the Duke in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The Duke smiled and said that when the Viscount was comfortable, they could hunt together. She was shocked, as she did not want this. The young lady froze in surprise. She didn't understand why the stake was so huge. She was puzzled because she had been spending time with the Duke. The young lady wanted him to stop looking at her like that. Adette was in shock and told herself that she would never change her clothes again. Contrary to the wishes of the young lady, an invitation arrived from the Duke. Adette was puzzled and didn't know when the conversation about investments would begin. The Duke looked at the Viscount and said that hunting seemed to be too boring for him. She said that it was not so. The Duke told the Viscount that he would like to visit his homeland, since he had not seen the sea for a long time. The young lady looked away and did not answer. She looked at the Duke intently and wondered why he was giving her puppy dog eyes. She sighed heavily and said that he could come to her any time. She mentally begged him to stop behaving like this. The Duke smiled and said that since the Viscount had invited him, he should come. She was shocked, as she did not want him to come. A moment later, the Duke pulled the young lady back, and she froze in shock in his arms. He glanced sideways at the young lady and told her to be quiet. She froze in surprise and a moment later saw birds in the distance. She looked intently at the Duke, who was looking at his prey with a playful smile. A moment later, a shot rang out, but the young lady did not take her eyes off the Duke. The Duke looked at the Viscount intently and said with a smile that he had hit the mark. She said nothing, only looked away from him. A few minutes later, the Duke's companions ran up to him. The young lady was embarrassed because she was very surprised. She thought that only he could laugh like that. The Duke glanced sideways at the Viscount and said that he was riding a horse much better than he thought. The young lady looked at the Duke with a smile and thanked him. The Duke froze in surprise, but a moment later he smiled himself. The Duke told the Viscount that his estate was near the sea, and therefore he must know the sea well. She said that she could not say that she knew it well. She said that when she thought about what the sea understood, it became unfamiliar. The Duke smiled and said that the Viscount knew much more about the sea than he did. She knew it was natural, since she had been a diver in her past life. She called the Duke and asked if there were many investors. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he had been having so much fun that he had forgotten what they were going to talk about. The young lady was furious. He smiled and said that the investment was fine. He said that the investment in the Viscount was too large, and it was desirable that the number of investors exceed the amount invested. She was puzzled and didn't understand what he was talking about. She wondered if he was still interested in how she got the money. He said that he had actually already completed recruiting investors. She asked in surprise what he was talking about. She didn't understand why they needed to meet. He smiled and said that at first he was interested to hear that a family he had never heard of wanted to invest a huge amount of money. He smiled and said that he then thought he would be fun to be with and wanted to continue the conversation. The lady was furious. He looked hard at the Viscount and said that it seemed he had made a mistake. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he should have said that from the very beginning. The lady said that she needed to return home as she no longer had any reason to stay in the capital. The Duke was shocked. He called for the Viscount, but it was all in vain. The Duke shouted that he very much hoped that they would meet again. She was furious, as he had no intention of cooperating with her at all. The young lady froze in surprise, not understanding what was happening. She was surprised because she received an invitation from the Duke. He wanted to discuss the issue of investments again. The Duke wrote that he would like to meet the Viscount and apologize, and if he had not left, then they could meet at the ball. She also received an invitation in her name to the ball. Morris looked at the young lady intently and asked her what she intended to do. She was furious and did not know what to do. When the investment plan she had worked so hard on failed, she immediately left the Duke. But she was very surprised when she received a letter saying that the Duke wanted her to attend the ball. She knew that to some extent it could be said that it was fate. He looked closely at the Viscount and asked with a smile if he was okay. She said she was fine. but she knew that getting involved with him would only cause her problems. The Duke asked the Viscount in surprise why he had come to the garden. She said that she was bored in the carriage, and so she decided to take a walk. He looked at the young lady intently, not taking his eyes off her. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not understand why he was looking at her so intently. She wondered if he thought she was on a secret date. She was in shock, wondering who she could possibly have met. She thought it was probably more suspicious that the Duke was here at such an interesting time. He looked closely at the Viscount and said that he was looking for a blonde man. He asked if he had seen him. She said that she had not seen anyone like him. She saw that he was creating a smokescreen in case of a scandal due to a meeting with a woman. He smiled and said that they could meet a little later at the party. She slowly entered the hall and heard how everyone was admiring the celebration. Everyone admired the wonderful celebration, which was organized even without the hostess of the house. Madame looked closely at all the guests present and said with a smile that she really hoped that they liked everything. The Countess said that since there was no hostess in the house at the moment, she helped a little with the holiday. Everyone praised her. The ladies were discussing who the Duke would dance with today. The Countess smiled and said that she was also interested in who he would dance his first dance with. The young lady wondered if they knew about the Duke's arrogance. She knew that it would not be easy for the lady who would become a duchess. A moment later, she heard someone calling Lady Bears. She froze in surprise. Turning around, she saw her beautiful sister in a crowd of young people. She froze in surprise as she thought someone had called her. All the ladies said that Viola was very beautiful and many people were courting her, and they were wondering who she would marry. The young lady glanced sideways at everyone present. She heard them discussing that the Duke often danced with Viola. They asked the Viscountess if the Duke had really organized a ball for the young lady. They said that the young lady was very beautiful and the Duke simply could not help but fall in love with her. Adette was in shock, wondering if the Duke really liked her sister. She wondered if that was the reason he was interested in her investments. Madame looked closely at the Viscountess and asked if Lady Adette had not come today. She said that her eldest daughter's wedding was the most important thing. The Viscountess thanked the missus for her concern. She said that her daughter was not feeling well and so she should rest at home. The Viscountess, in turn, turned around in search of her daughter. A moment later, she froze in surprise and looked intently into the distance. The young lady, in turn, froze as she caught her mother's gaze fixed on her. The Viscountess asked forgiveness from everyone present and hurried to her daughter. The young lady was shocked. She realized that her mother had noticed her and went on the run. A moment later, Madame collided with the Duke and was taken aback. The Duke looked intently at Madame and asked with a smile if she would mind if he danced with her daughter. A moment later, the Duke and the young lady walked into the middle of the hall. Everyone watched the beautiful couple closely as they danced. The young lady, in turn, ran out onto the terrace with lightning speed. She let out a heavy breath as she realized that she had almost been caught. She knew that if she stayed here any longer, her heart would stop. A moment later, the young lady turned around as she heard someone whispering. She heard them discussing her sister. The young men were surprised, as they knew that the Duke had called her by name. They were furious as they realized that he was trying to hit on her. The young man looked at the young lady with a grin. He did not believe that the Duke would marry her. The young lady, in turn, was furious because she knew that the young man had already crossed the line. She knew that her sister was much more valuable than the Duke. The young lady stood frozen in surprise when she saw her sister dancing with the Duke. She froze in place when she saw the Duke and her sister looking at each other warmly. She was shocked and wondered if the Duke of Warden was really interested in her sister. She didn't know what would happen to her in that case. She stood quietly to the side while everyone discussed the Duke and his companion. A moment later, the Duke saw the young lady and gestured that they needed to talk. She looked at the Duke with bewilderment and did not even move from her place. The man quietly approached the young lady and said that the Duke was calling the Viscount to talk. Madame looked intently at the Duke, who was leaving with the Viscount. She looked at the Duke in surprise and asked if he was really accepting her investment. The Duke smiled and said that everything was correct, but there were a couple of conditions. He told the Viscount that he must sell him the territory of Philin, to lease for a long time. He said that the Viscount could sell the estate to him or provide it for a long time. The Viscount said he understood, since the Duke wanted to set up a shipping company in that place. The young lady looked at the Duke intently and said with a smile that it was an excellent idea. They drank champagne to the great deal. The young lady was happy because she knew the hard times were over. The Duke looked hard at the Viscount and wished him a good journey, but a moment later he asked for a minute. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that he would like to see her in a dress next time. At the same time, he called her the eldest daughter of Viscount Burs. The young lady was shocked. The contented Duke returned to the estate while the young lady screamed indignantly in the carriage. He smiled and said that the young lady had herself to blame for this. He knew that no matter how important it was, she really came and disguised herself as a man. He was surprised when he saw the amount of money she wanted to invest. The butler said that after doing a little research, he discovered that the Viscount was connected to the Burrs family. The Duke knew that this family were nobles without pride, as the family made money using the resources from their land. The Duke thought that the letter was sent by the Baron's son in order to invest. The butler said he had learned that the Viscount had only one daughter, the current Viscountess Burrs. The Duke was surprised that his eldest daughter used this name without any fear. He realized that she was problematic. The Viscount was bad at investing and running a business, but his eldest daughter was very different. The Duke was surprised, as he could not imagine that she would come to him dressed as a man. When he made further inquiries about their family, he learned much of what he wanted. The lady had a surprising, naive side. Adette was shocked because she realized that the Duke knew that she was a girl. Morris asked the lady excitedly if everything was okay with the investment. Adette wondered since when he knew she was a woman. The young lady was in shock and simply could not believe everything that was happening. The madam looked at her daughter and asked if she was okay, as she had heard screams coming from her room the previous night. The young lady apologized to her mother because she had not been well the previous night, but she was fine now. Madame smiled and said that it was clear that she was working hard for the good of their family. She smiled and said that thanks to the young lady, they could live a luxurious life. The madam said with a gentle smile that she did not need to put too much pressure on herself. The young lady looked at her mother with tears in her eyes as she was pleased with the care. She knew that if her mother found out that she dressed as a man, it would be a shock to her. Madame smiled and said that Viola had danced yesterday with a wonderful young man, the Duke himself. The young lady said heartlessly that it must have been very sweet. Madame smiled and said that lately the Duke had only danced with her, and everyone was very jealous. The young lady took a deep breath as she saw everything perfectly with her own eyes. Viola looked intently at her sister and said with a smile that the Duke was asking about her. Adette Z froze in surprise on the spot. Viola smiled and said that the Duke was interested in her affairs. Madame was surprised that her daughter was meeting with the Duke. The young lady smiled and said that she met him by chance because of investments. Viola S. told her sister that the Duke had praised her very highly, and he had said that she was much better than most men in business. The young lady was shocked. She wondered if he was just making fun of her. She didn't know about his intentions. The lady told her daughter that there would be many events next month. She smiled and said that she would prepare everything necessary. She smiled and said that her sister would soon receive an offer and they could buy as many outfits as they wanted. The madam looked closely at her daughter and asked if she shouldn't get married this year. The young lady was shocked as she was forced to try on outfits. The Viscountess asked Madame what was currently in fashion. Madame smiled and told her about all the new items. The young lady looked intently at her sister and called her. The Viscountess begged Madame to make the young leaguer's breasts larger. The Viscountess wanted Madame to add more exquisite ribbon embellishments. The young lady sighed heavily. She knew that she would never get married in this life. Unfortunately for her, when she got married, she was dying all the time. In all her previous lives, when she was dying, the young woman had one more thing in common. On her wedding day, according to her calculations, she was executed because of the revolution. In the next life, she was quickly sold as a concubine without a second thought. But unfortunately, she died that day due to the invasion of Japanese enemies. In her next life, on the day she decided to marry a man whose face she didn't even know, the Korean War broke out, and she died again. A few months into her new life, she thought she would get married. But in the end, everything turned out as it always does. Unfortunately, she suffered the same fate as in her previous lives. She got into an accident. All her previous lives were very short and lonely. She sighed heavily because she just wanted to start her own family. She was furious and didn't understand why she was dying just because she wanted to get married. She screamed furiously that she didn't want marriage. She just wanted to live. She screamed that if this continued, she did not want to be reborn. Moments later, she saw a light. Looking closer, she saw a silhouette. She was very puzzled as the light sea was blinding her. A moment later, she heard a voice telling her that there was a reason why her wishes were not coming true. She was puzzled because it was too loud and she couldn't hear anything. She was told that it was all because she was planning to get married. She froze in shock. Moments later, she realized the real reason why she was dying young. She wondered if it was all because she wanted to get married. The maid looked at Madame in surprise and asked why she was crying since the mistress was healthy. The madam said that she felt very sorry for her daughter. She did not understand how the girl could be born with such a face. The madam was shocked and wondered if her daughter would be able to get married. The young lady was shocked and wondered how a newborn baby could be so ugly. She wondered if God had given her any chance. She knew that things weren't that bad, and that her current situation meant she could live long enough to stay married. That's exactly what she thought. But from the day of her debut until today, she remained alone. She knew she wouldn't get married, and so she consoled herself with the thought that she was doing everything right. Madame asked her daughter what she thought of the Viscount. Although they had a small age difference, he was alone. The young lady was shocked and wondered if there really wasn't a big age difference between them. A moment later, Madame looked intently at her daughter and asked what she thought of that gentleman. The young lady was shocked. She learned that it was all useless, since even such men would not be interested in her. The madam looked at her daughter and with a smile asked her to wait a little. The young lady knew that soon her mother would give in and everything would be fine. A moment later, she heard some noise. Turning around, she saw her sister dancing. All the men said that the young lady was dazzling, and they were very eager to dance with her. A moment later, the young people said that Bears's first daughter was present at the event today. For some time, they discussed and compared the sisters. The young lady was furious because the young people did not shine with beauty. She looked sadly into the distance, as this was the reason she hated going to this event. The madam looked intently at her son and called him. The young man greeted the Viscountess with a smile. Madame smiled and said that they had not seen each other for a long time. The young lady, in turn, froze in surprise as she understood that mother was looking for a husband for her. The madam looked intently at her daughter and called her with a smile. She smiled and said that it was very convenient that her daughter was nearby now. She called her. The young man froze in shock. He looked at her with contempt. A moment later, the young lady came closer to her and introduced herself with a smile. The madam smiled and said that the young lady had high manners. The madam looked at her son and said with a smile that he should ask her to dance on the lady's spinning top. The young man was in shock and he saw his friends mocking him from the side. The young lady, in turn, was furious. She wanted them to stop, since she didn't even want to dance. The young man slowly approached the young lady and asked if she would like to dance. But a moment later, everyone froze in place in surprise as they saw the Duke. The Duke slowly approached the young lady and with a radiant smile asked if she would give him her first dance. Adette froze in place with embarrassment. She was surprised and did not expect this. The Viscountess looked intently at her daughter and said that the Duke extended his hand to her. A moment later, the young lady finally agreed to dance with the Duke. For a while, everyone looked at them intently. He smiled and said that she was good not only at riding horses, but also at dancing. He called out to her with a smile, still. But a moment later, O fraternized with her like a lady. The young lady sighed heavily and said that he seemed to have some strange hobbies. She looked at him and said she would have preferred if he had told her about it from the beginning. He just laughed. He said with a smile that he could never have imagined that a young lady from a noble family would appear in such a state. The young lady, in turn, froze in embarrassment when the Duke lifted her into his arms. Everyone looked intently and with admiration at the young people who were dancing for their own pleasure. She was shocked because she realized that the Duke was performing a dance that he only dances at the debut. She sighed heavily and said that she had no other choice since he had refused her investment because she was a woman. He smiled and said that it seemed like there was a misunderstanding between them, since he refused because of the business she was involved in. He said that he is a knight, and his duty is to protect his homeland, and he sheds blood and stands guard over the land. Looking at the young lady, he said that the act of simply buying and selling them did not look good to him. The Duke said that even at the first meeting, he tried to humiliate and drive her away. He smiled and said that during their dialogue, contrary to his expectations, she appeared to be a completely different person. He said with a playful smile that he really enjoyed spending time with her, so much so that he wanted to be her friend. The young lady froze in place in surprise. She had not expected to hear such a thing at all. He smiled and asked if she would like to dance with him again. The young lady looked at the Duke with confusion and surprise and asked what he was talking about. The young lady wondered in surprise if he didn't know that only lovers did that. She was shocked, because even at none of her birthdays had she attracted as much attention as she did now. Viola told her sister with a joyful smile that everyone was interested to know about her relationship with the Duke. The young lady smiled and said that they were just talking about business. She smiled and asked if they were talking about investing in a shipping company. She was glad that everything worked out for her sister. She wondered if she had discussed this issue with her sister before. A moment later, the sisters looked intently into the distance. The crown princess's maid, the young Countess Reina Huboden, approached the sisters with a smile. She stared at her sisters for a moment without saying a word. A moment later, the young countess looked at the young lady with a grin. Odette Z froze in place in surprise and wondered if the young lady was actually laughing. The Countess smiled and told the young lady that she was even more beautiful up close. She said that there were also rumors of her engagement to the Duke. She looked at the young lady with a grin and said that he had danced twice with the one who was her older sister. The young lady stood frozen in surprise for a moment as she realized that it was no longer surprising that the Countess had approached them. The Countess looked at the Viola with a smile and asked if the Duke was courting her or if it was all just rumors. Viola looked closely at the Countess and said with a smile that she was not sure whether she should answer this question. The Countess looked at the young lady with fury, as she did not expect such a thing. A moment later, she said that even the Duke seemed to be maddened by her beauty. She looked at the lady with disdain and said that if she only had one beauty, he would quickly get bored with her. Odette was shocked, as she did not expect such a reaction after a couple of dances. A moment later, silence fell over the room as the young ladies stared into the distance. Everyone fell silent and stepped aside, making way for the prince and the Duke. The young lady froze in surprise as she saw the second prince of Vishot for the first time. Kynixa. Viola looked at her sister and said with a smile that it was her first time seeing the prince. Odette Wu smiled and said that it was also her first time seeing him. They noticed that there was a Duke next to the prince. Viola said that he was amazing. The Countess approached them with lightning speed. Odette knew that if her sister was with the Duke, their family would become related to the royal family. She knew that if they did, their business would prosper. She knew that she had to stick by the Duke. The young men slowly approached the lady. The Duke called Lady Burrs. Viola asked permission to introduce herself. The prince smiled and said that the rumors were true and that she was the diamond of Soviet society. The Duke smiled and said that the family's eldest daughter was also present. The young lady smiled and introduced herself. She said that she was the eldest daughter of the family and her name was Odette. The prince looked closely at the young lady and asked with a smile if she was that pumpkin. The Duke froze in shock. Everyone present looked at the young lady in surprise. The young lady, in turn, was furious as she did not expect to hear such a thing. The prince smiled and said that he had heard a lot about her from the Duke. He said that he had heard that she was very intelligent, and that was why he wanted to meet her. The Duke looked at the prince intently and asked him to step away for a minute. The prince smiled and agreed with him. The Duke glanced sideways at the young lady but said nothing. The young lady, in turn, looked angrily at the Duke. She wondered what he had said about her to the prince. The Duke asked the prince if this was really what he had meant when he asked to meet the lady. The prince smiled and, looking at the Duke, asked if he had not spoken of her that way himself. He said he simply meant that she had pumpkin-colored eyes. The prince was surprised because the Duke had refused the investment because the investors were a woman. The Duke said that he had changed his mind when they met. The prince smiled and asked if she was really as ugly as the rumors said. The Duke said she had normal pumpkin-colored eyes. The prince smiled and told the Duke that he was the kind of man who would never marry. The Duke said that he was only speaking on a business matter. He told the prince not to worry, as he had no intention of getting married anyway. The prince sighed heavily and said that if this was so, he was very glad. The prince looked at the Duke with a smile and said that he very much hoped that he would not change. Sasha looked at her sister with a smile and asked if it was true that she had danced with their Duke several times. The young lady smiled as she looked at her sister. She said that it was nothing special. Sasha said that it meant that the Duke wanted to get closer to her. She smiled and, looking at her sister, asked if she really wanted to say something about this. S asked about it. Sasha hesitated, not knowing how to answer this question. But a moment later, she cried out that she would like to go to Lenosia. Odette asked if she really wanted to go to Lenosia's School of Magic. Sasha said that she had a friend who went to the School of Magic. Sasha said with a smile that he told her that she also had a talent for magic. Odette said that her mother would be against it. Sasha shouted to her sister that she was a girl herself, but their whole family depended on her. She shouted that she wanted to become not a good wife and mother, but a real magician. Odette sighed heavily and said that even if their mother gave her consent, it would still be difficult for her to get in. Since in order to enter the school, she needed to have a recommendation from a person with the title of Marquis or higher. Odette said that she really wanted to help her sister, but it would be hard. Sasha told her sister with a smile that that's why she brought it up. Sasha asked her sister with a smile if she could ask the Duke for a letter of recommendation, since she was such friends with him. Odette was shocked by what she heard. She immediately remembered his arrogant smirk with which he told her that she was the pumpkin lady. Odette was in shock and knew she just couldn't do it. A moment later, the butler entered their office and told the young lady that she had a guest. The young lady was surprised, as she had not invited anyone. She knew that her mother and sister were not at home. The butler said that His Excellency the Duke had come to see the young lady. The young lady was shocked, as she did not expect such a thing. Sasha, in turn, was very happy that the Duke himself came to them. The young lady looked at the Duke intently and said that he had come to visit them suddenly. The Duke smiled and apologized for his bad manners. The lady was shocked, as she understood perfectly well that he himself knew that it was impolite. But for some reason, he came unexpectedly and without even informing. The Duke asked the young lady where the other members of the family were. She smiled and said that her mother and sister were away. She looked closely at the Duke and wondered if he had come to meet her sister. She said that she was thinking of her returning in the evening. The Duke smiled and said that everything was fine, since today he had come to see her in person. The young lady looked at the Duke in bewilderment and asked what he was talking about. The Duke smiled and said that her younger sister looked very much like Lady Viola. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he suddenly started talking about this. The young lady, in turn, turned around as she realized that her sister was somewhere nearby. She was shocked when she saw her sister hiding behind the door. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and asked with a smile if she could introduce him to little Lady Burrs. Sasha, in turn, beamed with happiness. The Duke looked closely at everyone present and said with a smile that the rumors that the young ladies of the Beauty family were not lying. Adette was furious, since just recently he called her a pumpkin. The Duke looked at the young lady with a smile on his face. He smiled and asked if those were the books from the royal library on her shelf. She smiled and said that they were very useful in running a business, and that was why she often visited the library. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that she seemed to love reading. Adette Fee arched her back and said that was exactly it. She remembered being told that reading was a rather extravagant hobby for a girl. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that she had a very good hobby. He said with a smile that reading is an elegant and wise hobby that, regardless of age and gender, broadens horizons and is not subject to scandals. The young lady looked at the Duke with an admiring smile and asked if that was really what he thought. She smiled and said that she completely agreed with him. She sighed heavily and said that it was a pity that books were very expensive and not so easy to get. She said that if printing made great progress, then women from noble families and ordinary people could have easy access to them. She smiled and said that in that case, they too could live a better life. She was puzzled because she herself, without noticing, got carried away and began to talk too much. He looked at her closely and said that it was very interesting because she showed by her example that women can also manage business as well. He said with a smile that it would be very nice if women had more opportunities. Sasha looked intently at the Duke and called him. She asked the Duke with burning eyes what he thought about teaching the lady magic. Adette was shocked, as she did not expect that her sister would ask something like this. She wanted to stop her, but the Duke stopped the young lady, not letting her finish, and looking at Sasha, asked for what purpose she was interested. Sasha looked intently at the Duke and with burning eyes said that she wanted to become a great magician. The young lady was shocked because she realized that this was a terrible situation. Sasha looked closely at the Duke and asked if he could give her a letter of recommendation to a school of magic if she showed the ability. Adette was shocked, and looking at her sister, asked how she could suddenly ask the Duke about such a thing. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that he agreed. He smiled and said that if her family gave their consent, then he could not help but recommend her. He smiled and asked if he could see for himself that the young lady had abilities. He said that he also knew how to use a little magic. A moment later, the young lady decided to show off her abilities to everyone present. He smiled and said that if she could fill the given cup with water, he would recommend her to the school. Everyone present froze in surprise as they noticed that the young lady had actually managed to summon water. But a moment later, the young lady still failed to cope with her ability and accidentally doused the Duke with cold water. The Duke froze in surprise. The young ladies looked at the Duke in surprise and bewilderment as they did not expect such a thing. With lightning speed, Sasha left the room screaming. Adette, in turn, looked closely at the Duke as she was very worried that he could get very angry. She froze in surprise and embarrassment on the spot as she noticed his muscles, which stood out very strongly after all his clothes got wet. The Duke sighed heavily and, shaking off drops of water, said that the young lady undoubtedly had talent, and if she wanted it, he would certainly write a recommendation. The young lady approached the Duke in embarrassment and, asking for forgiveness, said that he could dry himself with this towel. She was puzzled and did not know what to do with such rudeness. She was puzzled and did not know where to look in this situation. The Duke looked intently at the embarrassed young lady. He slowly approached her and asked if she could forget the rude joke told by His Highness the Prince. She froze in surprise. The young lady wondered if he was worried about it. She smiled and said that she would forget about this joke. The Duke looked at her closely and said with a smile that many interesting things had happened since meeting her. He smiled and asked if she had forgotten the promise she had made while pretending to be a viscount. He smiled and said that he would certainly wait for an invitation to feel in. Madame looked at everyone present and said with a smile that the Duke had recently visited their mansion. She smiled and said that she and her daughter were not at home and they were unable to meet him. Madame said that their eldest daughter received the Duke well. The lady looked at Madame and asked if she knew about the Countess's house party. The lady said that only specially invited ladies and gentlemen go there, and it is a small party that lasts only one night. And they said that if even an old lady goes there, she will soon get married. The lady looked at Madame intently and said with a smile that she would try to get her an invitation. Madame looked at the lady intently and said that she didn't even know that she thought that way about her daughter. Adette was in shock, as she understood perfectly well that she would have to suffer again. A moment later, the butler entered the room and with a smile told the lady that a letter had arrived from the Duke's house. Madame smiled, as she was very happy. Madame said with a smile that the Duke really wanted to take a walk with her daughters. The Duke turned around because he heard someone calling him. He froze in place because he saw the princess. Crown Princess Alshena Elvong looked at those present with a smile and told the Duke that they had not seen each other for a long time, as he had not appeared at the palace. The Duke greeted the princess, and the princess smiled and told the Duke that he looked well. She looked closely at the Duke and said with a smile that she saw the rumors. She was not deceived. The Duke looked at the princess in surprise and asked what she was talking about. The princess smiled and said that she was talking about him getting engaged to an immense beauty. She said that everyone was very interested in his marriage. The Duke smiled and told the princess that he did not know that she was also very interested in it. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that he spoke as if he regretted it. She looked at the Duke with a smirk and asked if his chosen one could not become her friend. The Duke thought sadly about what the princess had said. He wondered if they could still be called friends. The princess smiled and said that the young ladies were shedding a sea of tears, and even her servant, the Countess, was very upset to hear these rumors. The Duke looked sideways at the prince and said that he was much more famous than him. The prince smiled, and looking at the princess, said that he knew that she had come exclusively to the Duke. For this reason, she had not even noticed him. He glared at the princess with his furious gaze. She looked at him intently and said that he should also find a good match to marry. He looked at her in surprise and said that he didn't even know that she supported him about marriage. The princess looked at the prince intently and asked with a smirk what he was talking about. She said that she simply hoped that he would meet a lady from a suitable family. The prince looked at her intently and asked who was really stopping his marriage. The princess did not answer, and with the speed of lightning, she left their company. The prince looked at the Duke with a smile and asked if it was true that he was more popular than the Duke. He smiled and said with satisfaction that his appearance was more outstanding. The Duke sighed heavily. He wondered if he should just hit the prince. Returning to the office, the prince asked the Duke what he was interested in about the letters, whether he had returned them all. The Duke sighed heavily and said that they had not returned yet. The prince said that they certainly needed to find them faster than the Crown Princess did. He said with a grin that she had started moving people there. He said with a grin that her game with dolls would soon come to an end. The young lady looked closely at everyone present and said with a contented smile that she really liked it here, since Lenocia was very close. Adette looked closely at her sister and said with a smile to the Duke that she was still a child and that he should understand her. The Duke said with a smile that if they had a little time, it would be a good idea to stop by Lenocia for a while. The young lady said with a smile that if they came too late, her mother would worry. She was puzzled, because she knew that they had already gone quite far. Cade smiled and said that everything was fine, since Madame herself said that they could return late. Madame smiled, and I, looking at my daughter, said that today they could stay as late as they wanted, since they might need a lot of time to talk. She was puzzled because she knew that her mother already had a plan planned. Sasha cried out with a smile because she noticed a boat nearby. Adette was puzzled because she knew that this was not surprising, and for a normal walk, they took too many things. Sasha looked closely at her older sister and asked if she wanted to go boating. The young lady smiled and said that she didn't want to do that. Sasha became very sad, and looking at her sister, she said that she would like to go boating. The young lady looked closely at her younger sister and said with a smile that they did not come today for entertainment. She smiled and said that they could ride next time. Sasha was shocked and did not understand why the young people were skating and they were not. The young lady looked into the distance and asked with a smile if they didn't match. Sasha looked at her sister in surprise and asked if the Duke and Viola really liked each other. Adette looked at the young people with a smile but did not answer. She stared at them and wondered if her sister would be happy if she married a duke. She was looking forward to her younger sister's wedding, but in turn, she knew perfectly well that she was a completely different matter. Since her life would come to an end if she suddenly got married. She sighed heavily as she understood where this emptiness came from. The young lady looked intently at her assistant and said that it was time to start preparing the dowry. He looked at her in surprise but said nothing. She sighed heavily and said that her sister would soon receive a marriage proposal. The young lady said that it was a great honor for their family. The young man, in turn, looked sadly at the young lady but did not answer. The Duke looked closely at everyone present and said with a smile that too much time had passed, and if they wanted to go to Lenocia, they needed to leave right now. Sasha agreed with the Duke with a smile. Adette told her assistant that upon arrival, she needed to give an invitation to the Duke. For this reason, the residence needed to be decorated. Morris looked at her closely and agreed. Adette said that Owl S does not collect many taxes. She was surprised and wondered how the people in this area make a living. Morris said that the land is depleted and reclamation is difficult since there are few people living in this area. For this reason, most of the residents are engaged in fishing. She knew that the category of fish and seafood is not included in the taxable goods. She knew that in this case, it is not surprising. The young lady looked at her assistant intently and said with a smile that she would borrow the tax code when she returned. Viola accidentally yawned and apologized to her sister, Adette. With a smile, apologized to her sister since they had traveled so far, and she started talking about work again. She looked closely at her sister and said that Sasha would be late. She asked her sister if she wanted to get out and look around. Viola smiled and said that she was very tired, so she would rest in the carriage. Adette looked closely at her assistant and asked with a smile if he wanted to go for a walk. He hesitated, but a moment later said that he had some business to take care of and that he would go later. Adette looked at him with a smile and said that she could not have done everything without him. She asked him to take care of his business. The young lady, in turn, walked slowly to take a late evening stroll. A moment later, she hesitated and wondered if she should turn back already. She froze in place in surprise as she felt someone's presence behind her. She looked at the young man in surprise and, in turn, wondered if it was really a local magician in front of her now. She froze in shock and couldn't move from the spot as she felt his destructive aura. She was shocked and realized that he was very dangerous. The young lady, in turn, ran with the speed of lightning. She was puzzled and wondered why she had to die again this time. This time she did not even dream of getting married. She was puzzled because she didn't want to die so early. The young lady screamed because she realized that someone had touched her. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise. She, in turn, looked at him in fear with tears in her eyes. He froze in alarm, looking at the young lady. A moment later, he asked what was the matter. Sasha screamed and called her sister. The young lady looked closely at everyone present and calmly said that an outsider had intruded on them. The Duke was shocked as he did not expect to hear something like this. He looked closely at the young lady and asked if she was injured. Adette Weiss sighed and said that she was fine. The Duke looked at Mayura intently and said in a hurry that they had to go already. She looked at the Duke intently and asked him to take care of himself. The young lady sighed heavily and, looking after them, quietly muttered that this was already the 5th time. She looked at Adette intently and said with a slight grin that the young lady was a very interesting person. Adette Z froze in surprise, but did not answer. The Duke glanced sideways at the young lady and asked in bewilderment what Mori was talking about. Miri bowed her head before the young lady and said with a smile that this time she must definitely achieve what she desired. Adette with everyone on her way back home, but she couldn't get everything that happened out of her head. She wondered if the young lady had actually seen the life she had lived before, stuck in her head, that she should achieve what she wants. She sighed heavily as she understood that she would have been glad if she had not died a quick death. She froze in surprise as she noticed that the Duke was looking at her. She looked at the Duke in surprise and wondered if she had imagined it and he had been staring at her. The Duke looked intently out of the window and said with a gentle smile that the moon was very beautiful. Adette, in turn, looked out the window shyly and said with a smile that he was right. And she was very beautiful. After the Duke's walk with the young Viscountess's Burrs, rumors of his engagement to Viola spread even faster. To find out the Duke's feelings, Countess Daisy invited 3 people to a party. Everyone wanted to know whether the lady would be engaged to the Duke. The young lady, in turn, had a good time with the Duke. Adette looked at her assistant closely and said that she was right. Anything that comes from the sea is not included in the list of goods subject to tax, and they are mainly engaged in fishing. Therefore, the tax collected there is small. If they take advantage of this opportunity, they can make a lot of money. The Duke looked at the young lady with a smile on his face, while Morris looked at the Duke with fury. The young lady looked at her assistant in surprise and called him. He was taken aback and answered his mistress with lightning speed. A moment later, he said that they could visit this land now, and it would be nice to take a look at the recently annexed lands as well. The young lady sighed heavily and said that it was all correct. She glanced sideways at the Duke and her sister, who were having a good time. A moment later, she looked at the young lady, who was, in some ways, the same as before. A moment later, a young man approached the young lady and greeted her with a smile. Adette looked at the young man in surprise. After dancing with the Duke, ordinary men began to greet her first. The Duke looked intently at the young lady, to whom a young man had approached a few minutes ago. A moment later, the Duke slowly approached the young lady and said that she worked even here. The young lady looked at the Duke in surprise, as she did not understand why he approached her. She looked at him intently and said that he wanted to visit the area as soon as possible, so she needed to work hard. Adette knew that he was just constantly rushing her, which caused a lot of work to fall on her. Viola looked at the Duke intently and said with a smile that he should understand her sister. She said that her sisters had a lot of work, and that's why she didn't even want to come. But their mother forced her to go to this event. The young man turned his attention to the young lady with lightning speed, and Adette Z froze in place, stunned by the sight. Viola looked closely at the young man and asked with a smile if she had accidentally interrupted his conversation with his sister. The young man smiled and said that it was not so. The Duke sighed heavily and said that, unfortunately, he too had been dragged to this celebration by force. Madame looked at the Duke closely and said with a smile that it seemed like he didn't want to come, but yet he was here anyway. She said that he said he would never marry, so she had no choice but to drag him to the party by force. He looked intently at his aunt and said with a smile that he would like to introduce the young ladies to her. He looked closely at the young ladies and said with a smile that he would like to introduce them to his godmother, the Countess. He smiled and said that she was also the organizer of this party. The young ladies in unison thanked the Countess for the invitation. The Countess looked closely at the young ladies with a smile on her face, as she knew that they were the ones the Duke was interested in. Viola looked intently at the Countess and with a smile. It seemed that the Countess looked intently at her as she realized that it was she, the Duke's chosen one. Adette also introduced herself in turn. The Countess looked intently at the young lady. A moment later, she realized that the lady was the same aristocrat she had seen earlier at the ball. Madame looked intently at the Duke and said with a smile that she was very glad. But her preferences had changed again, so she was thinking of postponing his wedding. The Duke looked at his aunt in surprise, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. She looked closely at the ladies present and asked if she should tell them the special reason for opening this party. She smiled and said that here and now it was not the parents, but they themselves who could choose their partner. Madame said that upon returning to the room after the party was over, they should take the silver candlestick that was in the hall, and they should wait for the man they liked. And the lady they liked should light a candle. This is a promise to go on a date tomorrow morning. She looked at everyone present and said with a smile that she really hoped that they would meet their true match here. The young lady was in shock. She did not want to meet anyone, even under threat of death. Viola looked intently at her sister and called her. She asked her sister if she heard what the Countess said about the Duke not wanting to marry. Adette looked at her sister in surprise and said that such a thing simply couldn't be. After all, the Duke had fallen in love with her. Viola looked at her sister with a smile and asked if she really thought so. Adette P. looked at her sister and said that, of course, that's exactly how it was. She knew that otherwise the Duke would have had no reason to be kind to her. The young lady slowly left her sister with a smile on her face. But a moment later, she froze in surprise on the spot, as she did not expect to see such a thing. The young man looked at her with a smile and said that they would meet tomorrow at the back door in the garden. Adette Z froze in surprise on the spot. She could not utter a word. Viola, on the contrary, was glad to meet. The next day, the young lady was in a hurry. She was in shock, did not understand where he had gone. She was furious because she had come all this way for one man. But to her regret, she had only met a strange man. She was furious because she couldn't even strike up a conversation with the Duke. She didn't know whose candle he had lit yesterday. A moment later, she froze in place as she saw the Duke, who was in a hurry. She knew she simply couldn't go back without knowing anything. The young lady hurried after him. A moment later, she froze in place as she heard someone calling her. The madam looked closely at the young lady and asked with a smile where she was rushing to at such an early hour. The young lady was shocked, since of all people, she was lucky to run into the Duke's godmother. She hesitated, not knowing how to answer the question asked. The madam looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that it was still too early for breakfast, and she offered to go and have a snack with her. The young lady looked at the madam in surprise and agreed with her, since she knew that she had no choice but to have another outcome. The Duke slowly cut a fine piece of meat for his companion. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that it was very nice to see her in the morning. The young lady froze in surprise. She did not know what to answer. She looked around the area with lightning speed, as she could not find her sister. She was puzzled and wondered if it was not her sister who was supposed to come to meet the Duke. The Duke ate slowly. He sighed heavily and said that I wanted to ask her that time. He sighed heavily and said that unfortunately there was no opportunity, so he called her separately. The young lady looked at the Duke in bewilderment as she did not understand what he was talking about. He looked at her intently and asked on the day of their walk if she remembered what the stranger who was at the School of Magic looked like. She sighed heavily and said that unfortunately, because of the darkness, she was unable to see the details, but he definitely had light hair that covered half of his face. The Duke froze in place from shock. His face turned pale. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked if he had any idea who it could be. Cade sighed heavily and said that he was not sure. She looked closely at the Duke as she saw that he asked no more questions. She looked at him closely and wondered if every time he showed up unexpectedly, he was drawing a line. She knew that the only thing that connected them was that he was a candidate for the groom of her younger sister and that they had a business relationship. Nothing more, nothing less. She smiled and said that the residence in Phelan was decorated, and she would have it ready when he named a day on which he could visit her. He looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that it was very good and they could go this week. A few days later, the young lady visited the residence in Phelan. She was glad because she felt most comfortable in this outfit. She knew that if she continued to dress this way, she would certainly be scolded. Sometime later, she sat and gazed intently at the beautiful view of the sea. She realized that this area was very suitable for a shipping company, with great depth and a convenient sandy shore. A moment later, they gave it out. She noticed that someone was swimming. She noticed that a young girl had come out of the sea, and now she was sure that the girl had not been swimming at all. She was surprised that the young girl was collecting materials and working so hard at such a young age. Adette slowly got ready to return home. A moment later, the young lady heard someone scream nearby. The man angrily pulled the young girl back. He did not understand where such a little thing could get so much strength from. She, in turn, screamed that she would not give him what was hers. Adette was furious and decided to intervene as she did not understand what such a big man was doing with a small child. The man got scared, and with the speed of lightning, he grabbed the little girl's bag and ran away. The young lady was furious and ran up to the girl and asked if she was okay. In turn, the girl burst into tears. The lady was shocked, as she did not expect this. A moment later, the young man approached the lady and asked if she had a sense of justice that had sparked in her, and she had decided to help. He looked closely at the young lady and said that now the little girl in the family has nothing to eat. Adette looked closely at the young man, as he was very handsome. She noticed that he looked like he came from a noble family. She looked at him intently and said that it was very rude to do this to someone who was trying to help. She felt like he was like the girl's older brother. He looked at her intently and asked if she really thought she had helped the girl. He looked at the lady closely and said that because of her actions and the horse, she was scared and everything was taken from her. Adette was furious because she only wanted to help. She looked at the man closely and asked if it would be enough if she replaced the lost food. She said that then the girl would not have to work at sea for a while. She was furious that a grown, healthy man was forcing his little sister to work. He looked at her closely and said with a smirk that it seemed like the nobles thought that money solved all problems. He said that even if there were silver coins in this province, it would be hard to get food with them. He said that because the owner of the territory had left the depleted lands unattended, only the local residents were suffering. She said that now new lands had been annexed, so the situation had improved, and the current owner was different in all aspects from the past. He looked at her closely and said that he doubted it, since, in his opinion, the nobles of this kingdom were busy making money only for themselves. She knew that the previous owner was addicted to gambling, and as a result, sold these lands for low price. She understood perfectly well how the villagers felt. so she did not want to be considered the same. She shouted at her lady with anger, because she wanted to stop the young people. She looked intently at the young man and told him to stand still. The young man looked after the young lady in surprise as she dived under the water with lightning speed. The girl looked intently at her uncle and asked if everything would be okay. The young man stood quietly and said nothing to the girl, but a moment later he rushed into the sea. A few minutes later, he saw a young lady gracefully emerge from the water. The girl was shocked as she noticed the young lady. Adette looked at them with a smile as she was pleased with her catch. The girl ran up to the young lady with lightning speed. The young man looked at her intently. Adette O gave the young girl her entire catch. The little girl was very happy because she knew that now she had food. The maid looked at her mistress in surprise and excitement and asked what had happened to her. Since she was wearing men's clothes and was also all wet, Adette Telos sighed and, looking at the maid, said that she was very tired and asked to get her ready for the bath. The maid looked closely at the young lady and said that she had a guest. Adette was surprised, as she did not expect any guests at all. A moment later, she saw the Duke in all his glory. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise and said that she had finally arrived. He looked at her in surprise, but a moment later he looked away in embarrassment and said that it had not rained, but she was very wet. Adette Z froze in place with embarrassment as she realized that she was standing in front of him in an ugly form. She sighed heavily and covered herself with her cloak. She asked him shyly if he wasn't supposed to come in a few days. She was puzzled because he came without even warning her. The Duke sighed heavily and, looking at the young lady, said that unfortunately his schedule had gotten mixed up. He had sent her a letter, but unfortunately he had gotten ahead of the letter itself. She was puzzled, as he told her that he did not do it on purpose, but still sent the letter. The young lady, in turn, was very angry with him, as she saw that he did not see any problems in this situation. The maid looked closely at the young lady and said that her bath was ready. Adette looked at the maid with joy as she arrived on time. The Duke looked at the lady and asked where the other members of the family were. She smiled and said that they should arrive in a few days, and she also said that her sister would be arriving. He looked at her closely and said that she seemed to really want him to be part of her family. She looked at him intently and asked with a smile if there was anyone in their kingdom who did not want to become related to the Duke. He looked at her intently with a smile on his face. She was puzzled because she didn't understand why he was asking such a question, knowing the answer right away. Adette smiled and asked what he thought about horse riding tomorrow. Hart wavered and said that he agreed. He didn't understand why she was the first to ask about it. She smiled and said that today she was looking at suitable lands for the shipping company, and tomorrow they could look together. The Duke looked at her closely and agreed with a smile. The maid looked at the young lady with a puzzled expression and said that she would be in big trouble if her mother saw her like this. The lady sighed heavily and said that her mother was arriving the day after tomorrow. Camilla was worried because she was worried that rumors might spread that the young lady had arrived at the residence with a man and they were left alone. Adette said with a smile that there was nothing between her and the Duke. She said this just a few hours ago. The young lady, with the speed of lightning, lifted the Duke from the bottom and dragged him to the shore. She was in shock and did not understand why he could not swim. In a hurry, she screamed and called for the Duke, as she was very worried. She was in shock and did not understand what kind of strange situation was happening now. The young lady slowly approached the Duke because she knew that she had to save him. She knew that she had to give him artificial respiration. A few hours before the incident, they were walking along the seashore. She knew that the sea in this area was deep and suitable for the departure of large ships. There were also cliffs and cliffs, which made this place also suitable for the location of a shipyard. He looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that this place was the best of those they had visited today. He asked if this was the land she had recently purchased. Adette looked at the Duke intently and said that everything was correct. She was surprised and did not understand how he found out about it. The Duke smiled and said that recently more than 1 or 2 people have been telling him about the affairs of the Bears family. Adette was puzzled. She said that there were many friendly people around. She looked in surprise at the Duke, who approached the young boys. He looked at them intently and asked with a friendly smile on his face if he could lend him a boat, and in return he would give them coins. She looked intently at the Duke as she knew it was useless. The young men looked at him intently and said that they did not need it. The Duke looked at them in surprise and asked if they did not know what silver coins were. The men said that they did not need them. The young lady slowly approached the young men and asked with a smile, "How about it?" She provided them with a whole basket of treats. The The young men agreed and said that they could take the boat. She looked at the Duke intently and said that food was better for them than money. She was surprised and did not understand why the Duke needed a boat. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that recently she had not been able to ride a boat on the shore of the lake. For this reason, he wanted to take her for a ride now. The young lady looked at the Duke in surprise. She was confused and amazed, as she did not expect to hear such a thing from him. Sometime later, they were carefreely sailing on the sea, the Duke looking intently at the young lady, and she, meanwhile, was looking at the children who were frolicking on the shore. The Duke thought for a moment and said that he would like to rent a boat at the place where he would be strolling with the young ladies of the bear's family. The butler looked at the Duke in surprise. He thought that the young lady liked boats. He looked closely at the young lady and said that he had heard that she liked the sea, so he thought that she liked to sail on it. He sighed heavily and said that it seemed that he was mistaken. The young lady was taken aback and said with embarrassment that this was not the case at all, and she liked everything very much. Just looking at the little children, many thoughts came to her mind. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what she was thinking about. She sighed heavily and said that she was now thinking about what one local resident told her. He said that the ruler of these lands neglected this area, because of which the residents have to live very hard. She sighed heavily and said that while she was attending balls in the capital, they had a very hard time finding a living. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said that it was not her fault, as the Baron had done wrong by losing the lands given to him at cards. She thought for a moment and said, "The residents might also think that she was no different from the previous owner." The Duke looked hard at the young lady and said that it was not so, as they would soon be grateful to her. They will be grateful that such a person as the young lady became the owner of these lands. Adette froze in embarrassment on the spot. She was surprised, because she did not expect to hear such words from the Duke. He smiled and looked at her and said that she would not neglect this territory. She had even already made a deal with him regarding a shipping company, and also sacrificed her freedom and dressed like a man. The young lady thanked the Duke with a smile for his comforting words. He smiled and said that this was not a consolation at all, but just the pure truth. She looked at him intently and asked with a smile if she could make him another proposal. He looked at her intently with a smile on his face and said that he was listening to her. She smiled and said that this place was suitable for the location of the shipyard, but it was far from the village, so during construction it would be very inconvenient for the workers. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he had not yet thought about this problem. She said that she would prepare housing and a dining room for the builders. Looking at the Duke, she asked with a smile what he thought about this. She said that in that case it was necessary to take care of maintaining public order in the city, since there would be more thieves than she thought. He smiled and said that he agreed with her, and upon returning to the capital, he would request a garrison. And if things went well, then these lands would soon become very lively. The young lady looked around the area with a smile. She was glad that everything was going so well, but a moment later she froze in place and wandered not far from El, and they sailed away from the shore. The Duke said with a smile that it seemed the sea was helping them, since they had sailed very far, even though they had not rowed. The young lady was shocked, since she knew that this was not help at all, but the ebb tide. During low tide, the waves can easily carry a man very far. The young lady rose with the speed of lightning and, looking at the Duke, said that he needed to hurry back. A moment later, she realized that they had hit a rock. She was in shock as water filled their boat. She knew it was only a matter of time before the boat sank. She was puzzled, because she knew that they had to somehow get to the shore. Adette understood perfectly well that they had a small but a chance. She looked at the Duke with excitement and called him. The young lady asked him in a hurry if he could swim, but a moment later she froze in shock as she saw the Duke drowning. She screamed and called for him, but it was all in vain. With the speed of lightning, the Duke plunged under the water. The young lady, in turn, did not lose her head, and with the speed of lightning dived after him in order to save him. Adette S. was able to save the Duke with artificial respiration. She looked at him, worried, because she saw that he had already woken up. She was very frightened and hastily called for the Duke. A moment later, she exhaled heavily as she felt relieved after he woke up. She said that they were very lucky that there was an uninhabited island nearby. The Duke looked at her in surprise and asked if she really saved him. He looked intently at Adette and with a smile on his face said that if it weren't for her, something irreparable would have happened to him. He sincerely thanked the young lady for saving him. Adette Z froze in embarrassment on the spot. She was excited and did not know whether they would be saved today. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said that when they saw the horse at the parking lot, they would definitely start looking for them. He said that they should light a fire, as this might help. The Duke, with his lightning speed, used his magic and lit a fire. The young lady was amazed, as she did not expect to see such a thing. She glanced sideways at the Duke because she felt different from usual around him. She wondered if it was all because they were stuck on a desert island, just the two of them. She hid her eyes from him. He looked closely at the young lady and said that she seemed to have a fever. She looked at him with confusion, as she did not expect such a thing. She looked away from the Duke and said that it was all because of the fire. He smiled and said that it was very good that she was not ill. He sighed heavily and said that she must be very tired and could now sleep peacefully. Adette looked intently at the Duke and agreed with a smile. She slept quietly, but suddenly heard the Duke calling her. The Duke looked at the young lady with concern and called her. He said that she should wake up as it was already starting to rain. Looking at the gathering clouds, the Duke said that there was no point in drying clothes anymore. Adette froze in surprise when she saw the Duke begin to take off his shirt. He looked closely at the young lady and said that if the body temperature drops, it will be very dangerous in this situation. She was in shock and did not know where to look. She froze in place from embarrassment. The young lady was very worried because he was too close to her. She knew that it was very dangerous and harmful to the heart. The Duke glanced sideways at the embarrassed young lady. He looked at her intently and said that they needed to stand like this for a while. She froze in place, not knowing what to answer. He sighed heavily and said that lighting a fire and calling for help would not work, and they would need to find another way. A moment later, the young lady looked into the distance and a brilliant idea came to her. She ran up to the Duke and asked if he could give her his shirt. The Duke looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect to hear something like that. The Duke was shocked, as he did not expect such a thing from the young lady. He looked at her intently and asked what she was making. A moment later, the young lady looked at the Duke with a smile and said that she had already done everything. He asked in surprise what it was, as he had never seen anything like it before. She smiled and said that by launching it into the sky, they would be able to call for help. He looked at her skeptically and asked if it would work. She looked at the Duke intently and said with a smile that they should still try. She was puzzled because a lot of time had passed and she was very tired, but unfortunately she couldn't do anything. The Duke looked at the young lady with a puzzled expression and asked her to stop. He said that he would like to try it. Adette, in turn, did not want to give up just like that. She said that she would try one more time. The Duke looked closely at the young lady who was trying to fly a kite. Adette looked at the Duke with a smile and said that he should see it since she had succeeded. The Duke, in turn, looked at the young lady with a gentle smile. He said that it was true. Amazing. The Duke walked slowly up to the young lady with a smile on his face and said that it looked amazing. The young lady slowly walked back and accidentally bumped into the Duke. She asked for forgiveness because she did not expect to bump into him. But moments later, she fell into his arms and looked at him with bewilderment. Cade, in turn, looked at her with a soft smile. He touched her face tenderly and said with a smile that he would take care of it so that she could rest for a while. She froze in surprise and still agreed with him. The young lady watched the Duke closely. She thought he was very hot without his shirt. She looked at his beautiful body from afar and could not take her gaze off him. A moment later, memories from the previous night came flooding back to her. She confusedly wondered if she was going crazy. Adette was in shock and wondered what she was thinking in such a situation. A moment later, the Duke called the young lady and said with a smile that a boat was heading towards them. The Duke looked closely at the young man and thanked him with a smile for saving them. He asked if the young man usually sailed this route. The young man said that he usually did not do this, but this time he saw something in the sky and decided to see what it was. The Duke looked at the young lady with a soft smile and thanked her, since it was thanks to her that they were saved. A moment later, the Duke looked back as he heard someone calling him. The knight looked at the Duke with concern and asked if he was safe. The Duke looked at the knight and said that they had arrived very quickly. The Duke smiled and said that fortunately a fisherman found them. He told the knight to give the fisherman 3 gold coins and that they should also buy the fisherman some good clothes. The knight was taken aback when he looked at the young lady as he saw her falling to the ground. Adette, in turn, sighed heavily as she realized that she had relaxed too much. She was puzzled and did not understand why she wanted to sleep so much. A moment later, she collapsed to the ground with a crash. The madam looked at her daughter with concern and asked what had happened to her. The young lady, in turn, lay on the bed with a strong fever. Madame angrily looked at the maid and asked what had happened. The maid hesitated, puzzled. And a moment later, she said that the young lady had gotten caught in the rain while out for a walk yesterday, which is why everything had happened. The young lady, in turn, asked her maid not to tell Madame what had happened to her. Madame sighed heavily, and looking at her daughter, said that it seemed that she was very tired when she alone received the Duke as a guest. She told her daughter something, and today she should just rest and not worry about anything. Writhing in heat and pain, the young lady still agreed with her mother. Adette slept quietly in bed. Through her sleep, she felt a delicious smell. She heard laughter from the room and thought that her family was doing well even without her. She slowly got out of bed as she felt disappointed that she had just been lying in bed all day. She slowly walked to the window and looked out onto the street. She looked in surprise at the Duke, who was fencing. The maid looked at the young lady in surprise and called her anxiously. She screamed and said that the cold wind was contraindicated for her, and with the speed of lightning, she closed the window. The Duke looked intently in the direction where there had just been noise. The maid looked closely at the young lady and said that she should rest well and get well soon. Camilla said with a smile that she would then be able to dine with the Duke and even ride a horse. Adette, in turn, understood perfectly well that this would not happen even if she got well, because Viola was now nearby. The young lady looked out the window and saw a beautiful picture. Sasha saw her sister with a smile and greeted her. Sasha smiled and said that the Duke taught her to ride a horse. Adette looked at her sister and said with a smile that she was great. The Duke looked at the young lady with concern and asked if she was feeling well. She smiled and, looking at the Duke, said that she felt much better. He looked at her intently and said with a soft smile that he was very glad about it. She looked at him shyly, but did not answer. Viola looked intently at the Duke. Adette looked at her sister with puzzlement as she saw her gaze. The maid looked closely at the young lady and asked if anything had happened between her and the Duke. She smiled and said that nothing had happened between them, and if her sister found out, she might be upset. She asked the maid to make sure that the people in the residence did not tell anyone. Sasha looked closely at her sister and said with a smile that they could go to their shore together a little later. The young lady looked at them intently and said that she could not as she needed some rest. She smiled and wished them a good walk. With the speed of lightning, she turned around as she did not want them to see her face. She sighed heavily and thought that most likely, because of her illness, she had become weaker in spirit. Late in the evening, the young lady went down to the kitchen to drink some water. She was puzzled, because she knew that when the Duke and her sister got married, she would often see a similar picture. She was very worried and did not understand why she did not want this. Adette sighed heavily, knowing it wasn't even funny. The Duke looked at the young lady in bewilderment and called her. She, in turn, looked at him in surprise and called out. She did not understand why he was not sleeping at such a late hour. Cade sighed heavily and said that unfortunately, sleep did not come to him. He looked closely at her and asked if she was feeling okay. Adette looked at Cade and said that everything was fine, and that they could plan the schedule together starting tomorrow. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and said that it was very late and they had to get up. He smiled and said that he would see her out. She looked at him intently as she remembered that even at the Countess's party, he had not seen her sister off, but had seen her off. She was puzzled and did not understand why he showed kindness to her so often. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that they had already arrived. The Duke smiled and extended his hand to her. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment. He took her hand with a radiant smile and kissed it tenderly, wishing her good night. She froze in embarrassment and surprise as the skin he touched with his lips burned. She looked at him intently and in a cold tone, wished him good night. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise. She sighed heavily as she thought that she was not completely better. She returned to the room with lightning speed. She was in shock and wondered why she had a fever again. The maid knocked on the young lady's door and asked if she was awake. Adette looked intently at the maid and asked with a smile where her family was. The maid smiled and said that they were all in the living room with the Duke. Looking at the lady, she said that she seemed to have completely recovered. The young lady slowly walked down the stairs. She was hurrying to her family. Madame looked intently at the Duke and said that she was very sorry that it was time for him to go. Adette Z stood frozen in place, listening to their conversation. The Duke thanked Madame with a smile. He said that he would like to stay longer, but there were still matters in the capital that he needed to sort out as soon as possible. Adette V flew into the room and asked the Duke if he was leaving today. She was surprised because she knew that he had not told her anything last night. He looked at the young lady intently with a soft smile on his face. Madame looked closely at her daughter and said with a smile that everything was exactly like that. Since the Duke and her sister decided to return to the city, Adette was surprised that her sister also wanted to return. The lady looked at her daughter with a playful smile and said that Viola had also been there. Adette Z froze in place in surprise and looked intently at her mother, who was smiling radiantly. Madame said with a smile that it seemed the young people really wanted to get engaged. Adette Z stood frozen in place and wondered what she had expected. She was puzzled, because for several days she had been in close contact with the Duke, as if she had become a special person to him. She was very excited and disappointed. The young lady looked intently after her family. She knew that she just needed to wake up and accept reality. The young lady looked at the Duke intently and said that he must confess officially. The Duke looked at her in surprise, as he did not understand what she was talking about. He looked at her closely and wondered if all the young ladies in her family were so confident. The Duke smiled and asked who he should confess to. He asked if she really expected him to confess. Viola sighed heavily and said that of course she did not expect him to confess, since he should confess to her sister. She told the Duke that he had been interested in her sister from the very beginning. She looked at him closely and said that now he seemed to be very close to her sister. She saw that something was definitely going on between them. The Duke smiled and said that he did not know that. The young lady looked at the Duke intently and said that her sister was not smart in love affairs, and besides, she thought of her family first. She said that her sister was not honest with her feelings. The lady looked at the Duke intently and said that she kept silent because she needed rumors about her and the Duke. He looked at her in surprise because he did not expect to hear such a thing. She said that he should be more decisive, since he should understand perfectly well that it is the girls who have it hard. She said that he does not want her to be surrounded by scandalous rumors because she is not getting married at such an age. The Duke was furious and wondered if the young lady had really said that he and Adette N should not even see each other if they were just friends. He was furious because he knew she wanted them to date as a couple. He knew perfectly well that it was true that he was happy to be with the young lady, but he never once thought about marriage. The butler looked at the Duke intently and said that he had received a message from Kamash. The Duke sighed heavily and said that it seemed that everything had been found. He said that he would go personally. The butler looked at the Duke with excitement and said that a young lady had come to see him, and she spoke as if she had urgent business with the Duke. The Duke, in turn, rushed with lightning speed into the office where the young lady was waiting for him. He quickly entered the office and saw an excited young lady. Adette looked intently at the Duke and with a scream called out to him. He felt an unknown emotion as soon as he saw her expression. He looked at the young lady with concern and asked what was wrong. He said that she should calm down and sit down. The young lady looked sideways at everyone present in the room and asked the Duke to tell everyone to leave. The Duke looked closely at all the servants present and said that if necessary, he would call them, but now they should go out. Now the Duke realized that all his thoughts were arrogant. The young lady looked at the Duke trembling and asked if he had dropped her sister off in front of the mansion yesterday. The Duke looked at the young lady with a puzzled expression and said that her sister had said that she had some business to attend to and had asked to be dropped off in front of the dressing room. He said that he had told her that he would wait for her, but she had refused. The Duke looked at the young lady with concern and asked what had happened. Adette said in a trembling voice that her sister was missing. The Duke was shocked by what he heard. He stood up with lightning speed and told the young lady that she should wait a little, and he would return. She looked at him in surprise. A moment later, the Duke entered the room with documents in his hands. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and handed her the documents. He said that her sister had given him a package of documents before getting out of the carriage and asked him to give them to her. Viola wrote to her sister that she was very sorry, but she was going to go far away with her beloved. She wrote that she loved her family very much, but she could not give up her loved one for anything. She asked her family not to look for her. Adette was shocked because she realized that this was her sister's handwriting. Now she realized that no one had kidnapped her sister, but she had escaped on her own. The young lady was shocked because she did not know who her beloved sister had run away with. The Duke looked at the young lady intently, and with a sad expression on his face, said that he, unfortunately, did not know what had happened, but if she needed help, she could contact him at any time. The young lady looked at the Duke intently and thanked him with a smile, but said that he should not do that at all. She sighed heavily, for she knew that in order for Togo to find her sister, she would greatly need the Duke's help. But she was puzzled, for she did not know how she could tell him about it, since she could not kindly ask him to find a girl who had apparently run away with another man. The Duke looked closely at his companion and asked if her sister had run away. She was taken aback and asked what he was talking about. She sighed heavily, for that was the reason she did not like men who were quick-witted. She looked at the Duke intently and said that it was not yet known. A moment later, the young man ran up to the young lady and called her in a hurry. The young man said that the butler had asked him to deliver an urgent letter to her, as he had learned the whereabouts of the young lady. Madame was furious and beside herself with anger. She was angry at the young man because he had so basely repaid her for his favor. She was furious and did not understand how he dared to take her daughter away. Adette S. was informed that the young lady had run away with Morris. The young lady was shocked and did not expect such a thing from her assistant. She remembered how she told the young man that it was time to prepare a dowry for her sister, since she would soon be getting married. Then he listened to her silently and did not answer. She remembered how her sister asked her about business and investments. The young lady was puzzled, as only now did she understand why her sister was asking about business. She staggered as she felt ill for a moment. The Duke looked at the young lady with concern and called her. Without showing himself for several days, he visited the boarding house, and it was said that a few days ago he ran away with some girl. The servant slowly handed the young lady the letter that he left for her. Morris wrote to the young lady that they were planning to go to the Empire. He wrote that although he had decided to follow the young lady's wish to leave the place, but he knew that the young lady could not cope on her own. With the life of a commoner, he wrote that in a few days they would arrive at the border. He asked her to be sure to follow her sister and convince the young lady. He hoped that she would arrive before it was too late. The young lady was furious, as she knew perfectly well that it was because of him that she had to dress up as a man again. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that it suited her very well. He said that he had worn this outfit in his youth, but he was very glad that the clothes suited her. She looked at the Duke in surprise and wondered if it was really a compliment. She disguised herself, and for security reasons, since there are many bandits in the border area, the Duke looked closely at the young lady and asked what about her wearing his suit. She was shocked, since he then openly told her to dress up as a man. She sighed heavily and asked for forgiveness for the fact that D had used his help to such an extent. The Duke looked at her closely and said that in this situation every hour was important, so this matter could not tolerate delay. He said that he had already sent a messenger bird to the border, which could delay their arrival. He sighed heavily and said that unfortunately they would have to travel all night without stopping to be able to catch up with them. The young lady looked at the Duke intently, as she knew that he was almost engaged to her sister, but now he acted as if he did not care at all. She was puzzled and knew that this simply could not be. The young lady sighed heavily and sincerely asked the Duke for forgiveness. The Duke smiled and said that he was fine, and that she didn't need to worry about him at all. He looked at her intently and asked with a smile if she also thought that he was going to marry the young lady Viola. Adette froze in surprise, looking at the Duke. A moment later, she asked if that was not true, and the Duke sighed heavily and said that it was not true at all. She thanked him, but still did not understand why he helped her so much. The Duke sighed heavily and said that it did not mean anything. She looked at him in surprise and asked with embarrassment what he was talking about. He looked at her intently and said that he thought she had doubts about the reason for his kindness. The Duke looking at the lady said that she considered her only the whim of a boring nobleman. He looked closely at the young lady and asked what she would do when she met her sister. She sighed heavily and said that it would be right to take her away before rumors spread, because if this situation became known in high society, there would be scandalous rumors. She sighed heavily and said that the current family business and investments would turn into a bubble, but a moment later she said that she would certainly listen to her sister's story. The Duke looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. The real reason she was making money all this time was because of what she had failed to do in her past life. She was the one who wanted to protect the fortress called family. All for the sake of protecting this fortress, she would bring her sister home. She didn't know if she would be truly happy, and if her family would be happy. She sighed heavily and said that she thought the scandalous rumors would die down over time, and that she would be able to get her business going again. The Duke froze in surprise, as he did not expect to hear such a thing from her. She sighed heavily and said that her sister would have to hide herself for the rest of her life to preserve the family's honor. She said that she really wanted her sister to be happy. The Duke turned his gaze away from the young lady and said that she was much more romantic than he had given her credit for. He said that she should be realistic. He sighed heavily and, lost in thought, said that her sister had lived her whole life as an aristocrat, and that in the morning she would become a commoner. The young lady, in turn, understood perfectly well that the Duke was right. Since she knew very well that her sister didn't know what it was like to go out of her way to survive, she wondered if her sister had chosen this life for herself. A few days later, we finally arrived at the border. The young lady looked around in a hurry. A moment later, she finally found her sister. She screamed and called her, Viola, startled when she saw her sister in the distance. Adette looked at her sister intently, and a moment later she ran after her. She screamed and called for her sister, but it was all in vain. Viola froze in surprise as she saw that her lover had caught her and was holding her. She screamed and demanded that he let her go. She looked at her closely and asked why he stopped her. She shouted that they should leave quickly. Adette was breathing heavily after a hard run. The young men looked at the young lady in surprise. Adette looked at her sister intently and called out to her with tears in her eyes. She slowly walked up to her sister and told her to talk to her. Viola looked at her sister intently and asked in a trembling voice if she couldn't just pretend she didn't see her. The young lady looked at her sister in surprise. Viola looked at her sister with tears in her eyes and said that this was her last request. Morris looked closely at the young lady, for he did not at all think that she would come alone. He was surprised that she came with the Duke. He looked closely at the young lady and said excitedly that knowing the Duke, he would not sit idly by, and the young lady would be in trouble. Viola looked at him and said with a smile that he should not worry about such things, since the Duke did not want to marry her anyway. She looked at her lover with a tender smile and said that the Duke was only testing his interest in her family because of her older sister. She was sure that he would definitely help Adette if she got into trouble. The young lady looked closely at her sister and asked if she would regret this choice. Viola looked closely at her sister and said with a smile that, as she had said earlier, there would be difficult moments. But still, this was the life she had chosen herself. Looking at her sister, she said that she had always lived the way others expected of her. But when she fell in love with Morris, she realized what she wanted. The young lady looked intently at her sister, but did not answer. Viola smiled and said that if she married the man she chose, she could live comfortably with her mother. But that way, she would only be deceiving her heart. She looked at her sister with a radiant smile and said that she was sure that if she were with Maurice, she would be able to overcome any difficulties. The young lady smiled and agreed with her sister. She knew that during this time, she had never tried to listen to her sister. She judged her happiness by her own standards, but she hoped that it was not too late. She looked at her sister closely and with a smile handed her the precious necklace. She said she was in a hurry, so this is all she had. The young lady hugged her dear sister tightly and warmly. Adette O, hugging her sister, said that if she suddenly felt bad, she could return home at any time. The young lady was shocked, as she did not expect to hear such a thing from her sister. She hugged her tenderly. The young lady looked at her assistant and called him. The Duke looked at the young man in surprise as he looked like a puppy. A moment later, the Duke winced as the young lady slightly beat her assistant. Viola looked at her sister in surprise and with tears in her eyes, as she did not expect this. Adette P. looked at them and said that this was punishment for the fact that he deceived her. She looked at the young man and said that if her sister cried, she would come to him and punish him. He sighed heavily and said that he remembered everything. The young lady looked closely at her sister and with tears in her eyes said goodbye to her. She hoped that her sister would be happy. The young lady was puzzled, because the road back was simply terrible. When she was driving to pick up her sister, she was so out of her mind that she did not notice the bad road. She had not slept for several days, and she was having a hard time. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said that she seemed to be in great distress. He asked if she was all right. She sighed heavily and said that she was not at all well. He looked at her intently and asked if she would like to rest a little in that case. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The Duke, with a beaming smile, said that his estates were nearby. They could go there and rest a little. She looked at the Duke intently and said that she thought they had better go back, as her mother was very worried. Cade looked at the young lady intently and said that he had already sent the letter, madam. He looked at her closely and said that if she overtired herself now, she might get sick like last time. She knew that worrying about her mother was half the excuse. She was puzzled and wondered what if rumors spread that the eldest daughter of the family was wearing men's clothes. She sighed heavily and said that her appearance was not very good. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about, since she looked very beautiful now. She was shocked, since she understood that he was just teasing her. She had oily hair and skin that had not been washed for several days. The Duke touched her face tenderly and smoothly touched her hair. The young lady froze in surprise. He looked at her intently and with a gentle smile said that she didn't need to worry at all. He smiled and said that the people of Kamach are not talkative. The young lady in turn looked at the Duke with embarrassment, as she did not expect such a thing. He smiled and said that they could go to the residence without any problems. The butler greeted his master with a smile. A moment later, they froze in place in surprise. Everyone froze, looking at the young, beautiful lady who was coming down. Adette was surprised, since he even accompanied her. Everyone looked at the young lady with admiration, as they could see that the Duke had brought them a new mistress. Adette Z froze in shock, but with a smile on her face, she understood that they were looking at her with heavy gazes. She knew that they all simply misunderstood everything. The Duke looked closely at everyone present and introduced the young lady to everyone. He said that they should not make her uncomfortable. Sometime later, the young lady was sitting in a beautiful bath. She sighed heavily, as she knew that she would never be able to ride in rented carriages again. She knew it was nice to live a life where you were taken care of, but she wasn't ready to give up and run away. For a moment, she wondered how strong her sister's love was. She didn't know what had prompted her to come to such a decision. She looked at her sister intently and asked since when. She did not understand why her sister did not say a word to her. She sighed heavily and said that she needed the rumors to make the young man who loved her act. She looked at her sister closely and said with a smile that thanks to this, she also learned about the true feelings of another person. Adette looked at her sister with bewilderment. Viola looked at her sister with a smile and said that she should do what her heart told her. She looked closely at her sister and said that their mother wanted a good relationship between the Duke and their family. She asked her sister P why she didn't marry the Duke instead of her. Adette was shocked. She didn't expect to hear such a thing. The young lady sighed heavily as she knew that there would be no marriage. She really wanted to enjoy life for a long time. A moment later, the young lady heard a noise outside. The maid said that the master was not there and that it was forbidden to enter the room. The young lady, in turn, became wary and became very scared. She froze in shock and surprise when the door opened and a young man entered the room. The prince looked at the young lady in surprise and noticed that the Duke was indeed not there. He asked for forgiveness with a smile and ran away with the speed of lightning. The young lady, in turn, screamed, and her scream spread throughout the entire estate. After taking a bath, the Duke heard the young lady's scream. With the speed of lightning, he ran into the bathroom where the young lady was. He was excited and wanted to know what had happened. He froze in surprise when he saw the young lady with tears in her eyes. KLZ froze in place with embarrassment when he saw the young lady. The maid looked at the Duke in surprise and asked what he was doing there. She shouted that he, without even dressing again, had grabbed his sword. The Duke left the premises with lightning speed and asked the lady's forgiveness. He said that because of the loud noise, he thought that a stranger had entered her room. She looked intently at the Duke but said nothing. The maid looked closely at the Duke and said that a stranger was here. She said that the prince suddenly entered the bathroom and the lady was very scared. The Duke, in turn, was furious. He could not believe that the prince had unceremoniously burst into the bathroom. The prince looked closely at everyone present and with an innocent smile said that it was indeed his mistake. The young lady looked at the prince with a smile on her face, wondering if he really had no manners at all. The Duke angrily told the prince to politely ask for forgiveness. The prince hesitated, looking at the Duke. He understood that he could not get out of it. He asked the young lady for forgiveness. The prince looked timidly at the young lady and apologized for watching her in the bathroom. He sighed heavily and said that although it was his mistake, he still committed a great rudeness towards the young lady. The prince, in turn, looked sideways at the Duke as he wanted to know if he was satisfied. The Duke did not answer and began to eat silently. The prince glanced sideways at the Duke and asked if this was too much for him to raise his sword. The prince said that he really thought that an intruder had broken into the Duke's room. The Duke sighed heavily and told the prince that he had come to him even though he had not even been invited. The Duke was surprised because even when he took the sword in his hands, the prince could not say anything. The prince was shocked. He said that he was very offended. The prince said that the Duke rented a carriage and left the capital with the girl. He looked at the Duke intently and said with a smile that he thought the Duke was ready to run away for love. Everyone froze in shock on the spot. The Duke angrily told the prince that he seemed to not trust him. The prince said that he trusted, but he could not trust the people around him. The young lady froze in place and wondered if he was talking about her now. The prince looked at the Duke intently and said that he could not even imagine that the Duke would return to the estate with a young lady. She was shocked, wondering if she could not come to the estate. The prince told the Duke that he thought that he brought the girl for one night of fun. The young lady, in turn, choked on her tea as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She was shocked, wondering what the prince was even talking about. The Duke looked at the prince with anger and asked if he was really trying to insult him now. The prince looked at the Duke with a smile and said that it was just a joke. He did not understand why the Duke was so serious. The young lady was puzzled. She did not understand what had happened to the atmosphere in the hall. She looked closely at the prince and wondered if he was being too casual even for a childhood friend. She knew that if anyone saw them now, they would think they were brothers. The prince said with a smile that the dinner was simply wonderful, and he also asked the duke if he would like to organize a ball on the occasion of his arrival in Kamash. Since he wanted to hear the stories of the nobles living near the border, the duke said that they were leaving for the capital the following morning. The prince was surprised and did not understand why there was such a rush. The prince shouted that it took him several days to come to the estate. He said that it was too cruel and asked them to stay a little. The young lady sat quietly and listened to their conversation as the prince reminded her of the whims of her younger sister. She thought that her mother was having a hard time taking care of her sister now. The duke looked closely at the prince and said that he was returning to the capital, as he had a lot of business, and that the viscountess was already waiting for the young lady at home. The prince looked at the duke intently and said that he could send a letter to the viscountess and the problem would be solved. The duke looked closely at the prince as he saw that he was very stubborn. The young lady was shocked, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She did not want to stay at all. She knew that normally her mother would have been happy to receive the letter, but not now that her sister had run away. She understood perfectly well that this situation would only exacerbate her stress. The young lady looked intently at the duke, but said nothing. The duke looked at the prince intently and said that they could send the young lady first and they would go hunting together. The prince sighed heavily and, like a capricious child, said that he did not want this. He said that he wanted to go with the young lady as well, since he would like to take this opportunity to make friends. The duke looked at the prince intently and said that it would be very difficult for the young lady. The prince looked at those present in bewilderment as he did not understand what was so difficult. The young lady, in turn, saw that the more the duke stood up for her, the more active the prince's resistance became. The young lady looked at the prince intently and said with a smile that she was honored that he thought positively of her. She said that she would follow his wish and stay for a while. The prince looked intently at the young lady and a moment later said with a smile that it was very good that she understood what he wanted. The prince sighed heavily and said that the young lady was very calculating and also quick-witted. He sighed heavily and said that it was dangerous to keep such a girl near him. He looked at the duke intently and asked why he didn't get closer to her. The duke, in turn, did not respond to the prince's words. A moment later, he looked at the prince and said that he had already been informed that all the letters had been found. The prince looked intently at the duke. A moment later, he asked in bewilderment if it really meant that young Lady Burrs had misled everyone. The duke said that all that needed to be done was to sort out the letters and return. He was puzzled, as he did not understand why they should have a ball. He told the prince that he had only tired him out. The prince sighed heavily and said that he had a reason for it. The prince said that the crown princess could have assigned someone to him. He asked the duke with a grin on his face if he shouldn't pretend to be a carefree man attending balls on the outskirts. In turn, Duke Rakovsky oversaw all preparations for the upcoming celebration. At the same time, the prince enjoyed rest and preparations for the holiday. The young lady, in turn, unfortunately, could not enjoy the preparations. The maid looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that the outfit suited her very well. Adette was in shock, as she had nothing to breathe with. She was puzzled, as she could not even take a full breath. The maid said with a smile that this outfit belonged to Her Highness the Crown Princess. For this reason, it was not suitable for most people. She looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that the outfit suited her very well. Adette was surprised, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. The maid looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that when she was young, the princess often came to visit them. She smiled and said that the three of them got along very well with each other, and the princess followed her master everywhere. The maid smiled and said that he competed with His Highness the Prince and Her Highness the Crown Princess every day. He was always the mediator between them. She was surprised that the Crown Princess's outfit was left in the estate. She wondered if the princess was the duke's first lover. The young lady sighed heavily. She felt very tight in this outfit. The maid looked closely at the young lady and said that if it was too tight for her, she would loosen the corset a little later. A moment later, the maid told the master that she had brought the lady to him. The young lady, in turn, slowly entered the office. The duke looked at her intently and said with a smile that he was very glad that she had come. He froze in shock as he saw that the young lady was not feeling well. He noticed her pale face. The young lady, in turn, looked intently at the duke, as he wondered if he was confused because she was wearing the attire of the crown princess. Adette could not bear it and collapsed to the ground. The duke, in turn, picked up the young lady with the speed of lightning and called her, but it was all in vain. He was shocked and screamed in rage and asked how tightly they had tightened the corset. He saw that she was not breathing. A moment later, the young lady finally came to her senses. The Duke loosened her corset with lightning speed. She was embarrassed, but still glad that she could breathe deeply. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and asked for forgiveness. Adette looked at the Duke with bewilderment, as she did not understand what he was talking about. He said that he would like to ask forgiveness for touching her body without permission, since this situation looked very dangerous. She looked at him intently and said that it was done very skillfully. The Duke froze in surprise on the spot. He shouted that this was not so, since the men's outfit was the same. She did not answer anything, since she knew that he had helped her and she should forget about this incident. The young lady looked at the Duke intently and asked him why he had called her. He smiled and said that he had something for her. A moment later, he opened the box and showed her a beautiful set of jewelry. He smiled and asked if she liked the necklace. At the border, the young lady was taken aback, as she had never seen such a beautiful set before. He looked at her intently and asked with a smile if he could do it himself. She froze in surprise and, looking at the Duke, wondered why he was giving her such a set. He smiled and said that she did not need to worry and she should just accept it, as his apology. He looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that he really hoped that she would take this necklace as a gift for coming to his estate. The young lady froze in embarrassment and could not utter a word. The Duke in turn looked at the young lady with embarrassment. She turned around and thanked him with a smile, but a moment later she froze in place with embarrassment, as he was too close. A little more and their lips would have touched in a passionate kiss, but the Duke walked away from the young lady with lightning speed. He was very embarrassed. Clearing his throat, he said that they needed to go to the ballroom. She looked after him in bewilderment. The young lady looked closely at the Duke, for she saw that he was as embarrassed as she was. Everyone was whispering animatedly and discussing this event. They were saying that they missed the crown princess as they had before. They said that when they came here, they thought that the princess and His Highness Prince Vishat would get married. The young lady froze in surprise at what she heard, since she had heard before that they were like cat and dog when they were children. She sighed heavily because she knew that she simply knew nothing about the relationship between a man and a woman. The prince slowly approached the young lady and froze in place in surprise. He looked at her intently and called out, naming the princess. The young lady in turn turned around and the prince froze in surprise on the spot as he saw Adette. The young lady in turn greeted the prince. He looked at her in surprise as he did not expect to see her at all. Adette looked at the prince with bewilderment as she did not understand his reaction. He looked away from her and said that this outfit did not suit her at all. She was shocked because he suddenly appeared again and was picking on her again. He said with a smile that the outfit was luxurious and the necklace and earrings sparkled, but the lady was not visible at all. He turned around with a grin and looked for her. She was furious because she knew that if he were not a prince, she would have simply hit him. A moment later, the Duke approached them and asked the prince in bewilderment what he was doing. The Duke looked at the prince intently and said that his behavior was very childish. The prince screamed as he did not expect to hear such a thing. The young lady breathed a sigh of relief as she was very glad to see the Duke. The Duke, in turn, looked intently at the young lady and asked with a smile if she would dance with him. She froze in surprise. But still, after some time, they were playfully circling in a dance. The prince, in turn, looked intently and disappointedly at the young people. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she felt that the prince did not like her. The Duke smiled and said that the prince was simply jealous because they were close. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The Duke smiled and said that even if it were not her, but other girls, he would not like his close association with them. She looked at the Duke in surprise and asked what he was talking about. She wondered if the prince had other preferences. The Duke smiled and, looking at the young lady, asked why she was reacting like that. Cade looked at his young companion with a smile and said that the prince cared very much about him as his assistant. She smiled and said that she understood everything. He looked closely at the young lady and said that she seemed to have no prejudices. He looked at her with a gentle smile and said that it was the first time he had met a person like her. The young lady, in turn, looked at the Duke with embarrassment, but did not answer. Cade looked away from the young lady sheepishly and said that the room was a little hot. He asked if she wanted to go out. They strolled leisurely through the grounds. He smiled and asked her if she liked the surroundings. He smiled and asked if she felt more free since there was no one here, and no one knew her. She exhaled heavily and said that everything was exactly like that, and if this were the capital, they would not be able to stroll like that, because rumors would quickly spread. The Duke looked at the young lady with a smile. A moment later, she froze in surprise, as it was the first time she had seen such a big moon. He smiled and said that the night sky at the border was simply beautiful. The young lady said with an admiring smile that it was indeed so, and the view was truly beautiful. She looked with admiration at the beautiful sky and the moon, as she saw that the landscape was very beautiful. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that her eyes were like this moonlight. She froze in surprise. She could smell the night air under the moonlight. It was mingled with the scent of violets. She didn't know if it was the moonlight or the tightness of her corset. It was hard for her to breathe. She closed her eyes as she saw the Duke approach her and reach for her face. The Duke slowly approached her and leaned towards her. The young lady closed her eyes, but she still felt his breath close to her. Moments later, she opened her eyes, realizing that nothing had happened. The Duke looked at her intently and with a smile asked for forgiveness for frightening her. He said that she had simply dropped a leaf on her. She looked at the Duke with embarrassment and bewilderment. A moment later, the Duke turned around as he heard someone calling him. The young lady, in turn, stood embarrassed in the distance. The Duke looked at his servant in surprise and asked what had happened. Adette, in turn, moved away and covered her face with her hands. She was very embarrassed, as she had expected something else. She was puzzled, as she did not understand why she had closed her eyes at such a moment. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said that he had urgent business and would be back soon. He told his subordinate that it could be dangerous now and that he should take the young lady. She shouted that this should not be done and that she would take a little more walk. Adette ran away from the Duke with the speed of lightning. Sometime later, the young lady of Seal sat quietly on the bench. She was puzzled because she was very ashamed. She wondered how she could now look into the Duke's eyes. She realized that only she was very excited. A moment later, she froze in place and wondered if she loved the Duke. But a few minutes later, she was overcome by a strong tremor. She did not understand what had happened and why she felt an icy cold. She turned around with lightning speed as she felt someone's gaze on her. The Duke looked at the man and said that he had tried very hard to find everything. He handed the young man the bag of payment and said goodbye to him. The prince, in turn, looked closely at the new documents. He was furious, as he understood perfectly well that his life was in danger because of some love letter. With lightning speed, he threw all the documents into the fireplace and said that they were finished with that. The Duke sighed heavily and said that this was only the beginning. The prince sighed heavily and said that if the truth came out, the Duke would also be in danger. The Duke looked at the prince intently and said that this would never happen, since all the people who knew the truth were already dead. The prince was puzzled. He looked sideways at the Duke and said that this was not so. He knew perfectly well that there was one more person left, and that was the princess. The Duke looked at the prince intently and said that even if she was the crown princess, she could not do anything without solid evidence. The prince said with a smile that he was encouraged that the Duke stood by his side. The prince slowly approached his friend and with a gentle smile said that he was the only one he could trust. With the speed of lightning, the prince's face changed and, looking at the Duke, said that he should not forget this. The young lady froze in place and stared into the distance. A moment later, a maid ran up to her and called her. She looked at the young lady with concern and asked if she had really been here all this time. She looked closely at the maid and wondered if the intense cold was because of the wind. Adette S. told the maid to loosen her corset a little. The maid smiled and said that she would do everything and show her to the room. The young man looked intently after the young lady. The maid looked at the young lady with a smile and asked if she liked the garden. She smiled and said that the garden was beautiful even in the night sky. She suddenly remembered the Duke, who said that her eyes were like moonlight. She froze in place with embarrassment and a smile on her face, as it was the first time such words were said to her. The maid looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that she seemed to be having fun in the garden. Adette hesitated, not knowing what to answer. The lady glanced sideways out the window as she felt someone's presence. A moment later, a young man burst into her room through the window with a sword in his hands. She froze in shock as she looked at the man. The man cut his sword into the air with lightning speed. The young people looked warily into the distance as they heard someone scream. A moment later, they heard that there was an attack on the estate. With the speed of lightning, the Duke burst into the young lady's room. He saw that she was sitting on the ground, trembling with fear. The maid looked at the Duke with excitement and called him. The Duke froze in place in surprise. He saw the frightened face of the young lady. The young lady, in turn, sat quietly on the ground, trembling with fear, her face turned pale. The maid screamed, looking at the master. She said that Blythe had burst into their room. The prince was shocked, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. He looked at the maid and asked where the young man had disappeared to. The prince looked at the duke and said that they needed to catch up with the young man quickly, but the duke, in turn, rushed towards the young lady with lightning speed. He quickly approached her and asked if she was okay. He was worried that she might be injured. She was taken aback and looked at the duke with a smile. She said that she was fine. The maid screamed that the young man had only cut the young lady's outfit and immediately ran away. The prince looked intently at the duke but said nothing. A moment later, he left the room and said that the party was over for today. The prince said that he was returning to the capital. The prince looked at the duke intently and said that he should deal with the young lady. The duke was surprised. Since the prince was the one who started this conversation, the duke looked at the prince intently and said that there was nothing to deal with. The prince looked at the duke in surprise and asked why he hadn't immediately chased after the young man. The duke froze in place, not knowing what to answer. He was surprised by such a question. The prince angrily told the duke that this was not like him at all. In turn, the duke clenched his fists in anger. He sighed heavily and said that it was useless. The prince looked at his friend in bewilderment but did not answer. A moment later, the prince looked at the duke with a smile and said that he was well versed in such things. He smiled, looking at the duke, and said that if he was hiding something, it did not mean that it was hidden. The duke looked intently at the prince but did not answer. The prince sighed heavily and said that he really hoped that the duke would not spoil anything because of some love. A moment later, the prince left. The duke looked after the departing prince with bewilderment. The maid looked at the princess intently and said with a smile that she had brought her tea that would help her fall asleep quickly. The princess said that she understood everything and sent the maid away. For some time, the princess stared out the window, but a moment later, she heard someone coming to her. She smiled as she was waiting for the person. She looked at him intently and asked with a smile if he had found what he was looking for. The young man fell on his knees and asked the princess for forgiveness. He said that, unfortunately, he could not find it. The princess, in turn, looked at the young man with fury since she was not ready to hear such a thing. The young lady sat quietly and stared at the fireplace. She remembered the eerie energy that emanated from the man. She understood perfectly well that it was the same man she saw in Lenocia. She looked at the maid intently and asked if she knew the man who had come to see her recently. The maid looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she was talking about Bland. She said that of course she knew him, since he was from Kamash. She sighed heavily and said that he was so talented that the previous duke treasured him very much, and he was the fencing teacher of the duke and the prince. The young lady was surprised, as she did not expect to hear such a thing, but in turn, she wondered why he had become such a person. The maid said that it was the year when the young marquise became the crown princess. He suddenly disappeared, and everyone looked for him for a long time. But he suddenly showed up. Adette was surprised and did not understand why he was doing this to her, since she knew that he was a person who was not related to her. A moment later, she understood everything perfectly, since she had decided to get married again. She remembered the moment when she and the duke stood by the fountain and enjoyed the beautiful view. The young lady was shocked and wondered if it was because the duke made her heart flutter that all this happened. The maid looked at the young lady in surprise and called her. Adette said that she was fine. With a pale face, she said that she had already come to her senses. She told the maid to collect the clothes she had come in as she was going to return home. The duke looked intently at the young lady but said nothing. Adette, in turn, sat quietly in the carriage and remained silent. She looked at the duke intently and said that she was also going to return home. He looked at her in surprise and said that, unfortunately, it was already late at night. He asked if she would like to return back tomorrow at dawn. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she wanted to leave right now. He looked at her intently because he thought that she decided to return home because she was very scared. He was puzzled, as he did not understand why her behavior had changed strangely. The young lady, in turn, bowed and asked the duke to be careful on the road. With the speed of lightning, she left him. The duke, in turn, looked sadly after the young lady. The butler looked at the young lady with tears in his eyes. Adette reassured him and said that he had worked very hard. She looked at the butler and asked where her family was now. He said that they were now at the Tarusafa residence. Adette sighed heavily and, looking at the butler, said that no one must have served her because she had been empty for a long time. The butler looked closely at the young lady and said that Madame asked him to give her a letter when she arrived. Madame wrote about her daughter that she would be resting for some time at her grandfather's residence. She told her daughter that she knew that she had not left because of business matters. She wrote to her daughter that if she could not find her sister before other rumors appeared in high society, she should say that her sister had left with her to rest at the estate. She was shocked and could not believe that in such a situation she was dancing at the ball and having a good time. The butler looked intently at the young lady and called her. He sighed heavily and said that a lot of things had accumulated during her absence. She entered the office and froze in surprise as she thought it was just a joke. At the same time, in the duchy, the butler provided the Duke with a whole mountain of documents, which also needed to be sorted through. The butler looked closely at the young lady and said that construction had already begun in the Owl. He said that thanks to the patrol they had requested, public order had improved noticeably. The young lady smiled and said that this was very good. She looked at the butler in surprise and asked who this Rezke was who was mentioned repeatedly in the report. The butler said that he was a young man who lived in the village and whose help had significantly advanced the work since he had agitated the villagers for cooperation and proposed a solution to the problem of food supply. The young lady thought for a moment as she wanted to meet him in person. She could see very well that for a young man from the village, he was quite resourceful. She wondered if he really lived several lives. The butler looked closely at the young lady and asked if they should invite him to the residence. She smiled and said that perhaps they would do so. She was puzzled as she had not left her office for a whole week. She wondered if they should take a little rest. The butler looked at her intently and said that she should do a few things and then rest. She sighed heavily but still agreed with the butler. She was puzzled because she knew that without her assistant there was more work. The butler said that this matter would require permission from the royal palace, and approval was required for at least 6 months. She was puzzled because she knew that it would take a long time. Her Naledi wanted to find another option. She knew that this issue could be quickly resolved through a person who worked in the palace. She wanted to quickly find such a person. She looked at the butler intently and said that she needed a secretary to replace Morris. She told the butler to place an advert. A moment later, the Duke knocked on the young lady's office door. He looked at her intently with a smile on his face. He smiled and said that he saw that she was very busy. The young lady jumped up with a surprised smile as she did not expect to see the Duke. He smiled and, looking at the young lady, asked if she had time for a cup of tea. She looked at him intently with a smile on her face as she realized that she had let her guard down. As when she looked at his face, her heart melted. She mentally begged him to leave the estate. She sighed heavily and said that he should see that she had a whole mountain of things to do. She said that the next time he made an appointment, she would make time for him. He looked at her intently and asked if she really needed a competent secretary. She froze in surprise. The Duke said that he knew a capable man and he had confidence in him because he was doing his job well. He looked closely at the young lady and asked her what she thought about it. She was in shock and no longer wanted to have any connections with the Duke, but she knew that they had been threatening her for a long time. Adette knew that it would be safer to work with a man for whom the Duke vouched. She looked intently at the Duke and said that in that case she had one request of him. The Duke sighed heavily and, looking at the young lady, said that he would not keep too much distance from her. She looked at him in surprise with confusion on her face. As he was leaving, he said that in the near future he would send a man with a letter of recommendation. She was surprised. She had not expected such a thing. She looked intently after him and remembered his face. A moment later, a maid entered the room and asked the young lady to have lunch with a smile. Adette O walked past and looked at the maid, saying that she had frightened her. The maid looked out the window in surprise and asked the young lady what she was looking at so intently. Adette sheepishly said that she was not looking at anything at all. The maid smiled and said that the young lady did have something with the Duke after all. Adette sighed heavily and said that it was not so. The maid thought for a moment and said that it was very strange. She did not understand why he did it. The young lady looked at the maid in surprise and asked what she was talking about. The maid said that throughout the week he had been coming to the residence. He was interested in whether the lady had eaten well, whether she had slept well, and whether she had fallen ill again. The maid looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that he came with these questions every day. She was surprised and did not understand why such a busy man did such things. Adette Z froze in embarrassment on the spot. She was surprised because she did not expect to hear such a thing. Now she understood why he had that expression on his face. She wondered if he was very offended. The maid looked at the young lady with a joyful smile and said that it seemed the Duke was in love with her. Adette said sadly that even if this were the case, nothing would change. since she had no intention of getting married no matter who the suitor was. The maid froze in place in surprise. She did not answer. The prince looked at his companion in surprise and asked if Blythe had already come to see young Lady Bears twice. The young man sighed heavily and said that someone had ordered it. The prince thought for a moment and said that he thought it was the princess's doing, since the crown princess was keeping an eye on the young viscountess, so she could use his services, even if it was just a trick. The duke shouted with particular fury that it was very dangerous. The prince sighed heavily and told his friend that he should not stop him. He said that this time they must definitely complete the engagement. The duke said angrily that he did not want the young lady to be drawn into their affairs. The prince looked closely at the duke and asked if he was really going to deal with her. The duke froze in place in surprise. He could not say anything to the prince. He was very alarmed by this situation. Many years ago, when the war ended, they made oaths to each other. They wanted to eradicate corrupt power from the empire. They hoped to usher in a new era. For them, it was a revolution. But for others, it was an uprising. They did not want anyone to be involved in their business at all. For this reason, they did not keep close to them what was valuable to them. The duke was puzzled, as the situation was very exciting. The prince sighed heavily and said that since the princess had rejected all his potential brides, there was no princess left who could betroth him. He said that if this engagement also fell through, he would have to marry a relative of the crown princess. The duke sighed heavily and said that he had not forgotten their oath. He was very much puzzled, as he was worried that the young lady would be in danger. He looked at the prince with fury and said that if her life was in danger, he could not guarantee how he would behave in this situation. The butlers informed the young lady that a man from the duchy had arrived. The young man said with a smile that this was their first meeting. He smiled and said that his name was Notos. Bolin. The butler smiled and said that this man, whom the duke introduced. Adette looked closely at the young man and thought that he would be better suited to a job that required physical strength than to be a secretary. She said with a smile that she was very pleased to meet him. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he had really come alone. The young man stood there, taken aback, and said that everything was exactly like that. Notos didn't understand what the problem was. Adette threw her extraneous thoughts out of her head because she was thinking about the wrong thing. She smiled and said that that was not the problem. She looked closely at the young man and asked if he could start work today. He smiled and said that he would start today. She looked at the butler and said that he should show the residence to the young man and hand over the work to him. The butler looked closely at the young lady and said that a lot of letters and invitations had accumulated. The young lady froze in shock when she saw a whole mountain of letters. Lately, the ladies of the Viscountess's family have not appeared in social circles, and many rumors have been circulating among people. The young lady was puzzled because she knew she had to go and explain everything. Adette was shocked because she realized she had too much to do. She sighed heavily and, looking at the butler, said that it would be difficult for them for some time. She asked him to respond to the invitation on her behalf. He asked if she would not even attend the ball of the Earl of Elvonge's family. Adette knew that an event like the Crown Princess's family ball would be attended by members of the imperial family and aristocrats. She sighed heavily and said she thought she would have to go to get a business permit. The butler looked at the lady and said that the last letter was from the palace. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect such a thing. A moment later, the young lady noticed that she had received a letter from the prince. He invited her to go with him to the ball of the Marquis's family. He wrote that he would send a carriage to her house in honor of the memory of what happened on the Camac estate. The young lady was shocked and did not understand why he was asking her to go with him. She was furious and wondered what rumors he wanted to spread about her family. She politely thanked the prince for his kindness. However, she wrote that she was only a lady from the Viscount's family. She was worried about what she could become for him. She wrote that he should be accompanied by another person who was his equal. The prince was shocked because the young lady refused him. He shouted that this was not in his plans. He shouted that she simply had to go with him. The young lady received another letter from the prince early in the morning. She was shocked and wondered if he was really that obsessed with escorts. She was puzzled because she didn't know what he was planning at all. She wondered if he thought she would peacefully submit and agree. She knew that if he wanted to get something from her, he would have to give her something of equal value. The prince looked at the young lady with displeasure and asked how many times she had refused him before agreeing. After this incident, they exchanged letters several more times. She looked intently at the prince and said with a smile that, as a businesswoman, she would not act without her own benefit. She said that she needed to accompany the lonely prince. She was puzzled, since there were already enough rumors about her family. She was furious, since she did not know how many more of them would be spread by those who loved to gossip. He looked at her intently and said that he understood everything. The prince looked at the young lady and asked what favor was being discussed. A moment later, the young man, completely unheard, shouted that the crown prince and princess were coming. The young lady, in turn, looked intently at the princess. She froze in surprise as she saw that the princess was simply delightful. She realized that the rumors were not lying, and she was incredibly beautiful. With tears in her eyes, she admitted that the princess dress did not suit her at all. Adette looked at the princess with a smile on her face as she realized that their eyes had met. She froze in surprise when she saw that the princess smiled at her. Sometime later, the princess and her husband were hanging out and playfully twirling in a dance. The young lady looked closely at the prince as she had heard earlier that there was something between them. Thinking about this, she saw that the crown princess did not pay any attention to the prince. The young lady, in turn, wondered if this was a one-sided love. A moment later, she realized that this was indeed the case. A few minutes later, all her thoughts disappeared as she saw the silhouette of the duke in the distance. She froze in place in embarrassment as he stared at her. They stared at each other from a distance for a while. The young lady was a little puzzled and agitated. She knew she had come to the party with the prince. She wondered if this had caused the duke to misunderstand. The prince looked at the young lady and called her. Looking at his companion, he invited her to dance. She was puzzled, since she did not want to do this at all. Now something was bothering her. The prince, in turn, looked intently at his companion and said that he had not heard the price of accepting his invitation. She said that she was going to build a residential complex on the ship plot in her domain, and for this she needed permission from the palace. The prince looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she really had any problems in getting the approval itself. The duke, in turn, looked with displeasure at the young people who were dancing and talking cheerfully. She hesitated and said that it would take a long time. He smiled and asked if she really needed his influence. The young lady smiled and said that that was exactly it. She looked at him intently and said that she was sure she could ask him for such a thing. The prince froze in surprise on the spot, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. He smiled and asked if she knew that she was good at lying. Adette looked at him with embarrassment and said with a smile that she was telling him the truth. He smiled and said that he felt it from their first meeting. She is very good and quick in calculations. Adenty said with a smile that she would take it as a compliment. The princess asked her friend who the lady was with the prince. The lady told the princess that she had already told her earlier. The lady said that this was young lady Viola Bears' elder sister, Adette Bears. The princess looked at the young lady with a sharp and angry expression as she realized who was being talked about. The young lady, in turn, really wanted to get home as quickly as possible and rest. She suffered throughout the entire reception as everyone asked how she became close to the prince. Everyone asked where her sister was. A moment later, the prince and the duke approached Adette. The prince told the young lady that he would take her there. Adette was surprised. She did not expect such a thing. Her companion looked at the prince with an admiring smile. She did not want him to see her off, as she wanted to go home peacefully. Milady thanked the prince with a smile for his concern. She said that she had decided to use the carriage of the count's family. The young lady looked at everyone present with a smile and said that they did not mind, and Adette could safely ride with the prince. Adette was in shock, as she realized that she now had no choice. Cade looked at the prince and sighed heavily, saying that he should just send the young lady home. The prince looked at his friend in surprise and asked why he should do that. He said that it would be right to escort his partner, with whom he had danced, to safety. The prince looked at the young lady with a smile and said that it was time for them to go. The duke was shocked. The young lady, in turn, looked intently at the duke as she did not understand his behavior. A moment later, the duke came closer to her and extended his hand to her. She froze, looking at the duke. But a moment later, she had already taken his hand. She looked at it and said that she had experienced an insult because of His Highness. He said that he was very sorry. The young lady looked at him intently and said that he didn't need to apologize at all, since that was what she had chosen. Cade stared after the young lady, puzzled by the situation. She thought for a moment, remembering that she had not even thanked the duke for sending her a secretary. The prince looked at the young lady with a displeased expression and asked if she was really thinking about the duke right now. The young lady was taken aback and embarrassedly asked the prince what he was talking about. He looked at her intently and asked if she really thought he didn't know that she had feelings for the Duke. She was shocked and wondered how he knew. Adette was puzzled and confused, wondering if it was really that obvious. The prince said with a smile that, after all, in the kingdom, the Duke was the second most attractive after him. The young lady looked intently at her companion. He changed his expression with lightning speed and asked with cold fury what she had in mind. He asked if she really intended to become a duchess. The prince said that after this she would not have to exhaust herself with business, and that marriage with the Duke alone would be an honor for her family. The young lady looked at the prince with fury. She did not understand what he was talking about now, not knowing anything. She understood perfectly well that everything was the opposite, and if she got married, her life would come to an end. She was furious because she understood that he should first find out about everything, and then start talking. Adette Faye sighed and said she thought they had all misunderstood her, because she was interested in business, and she never thought of it as a chore. She looked at the prince intently and said that she was not even thinking of getting married for the sake of a family. The prince froze in surprise, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. She said she didn't know what he was worried about. But the duchess was not the kind of status that could be achieved through desire alone. She looked at the prince intently and said that marriage is not one person's decision. He said that it was exactly like that. He looked at her closely and said that he just asked because he was worried that they were both worried about it. The prince said, looking at the young lady, that the Duke seemed to have never had such a thought. She froze, looking at the prince as she did not expect to hear such a thing. A moment later, she said that he did not need to worry about her at all, as she understood everything perfectly. Looking out the window, the prince said that if this was so, he was very glad. The young lady looked closely at her sister. She was very happy to see her. Madame also greeted her daughter with a smile. Adette looked at her sister in surprise, as she did not expect to see a puppy. Sasha smiled and said that he was very cute, and the Duke gave him to her. The young lady was surprised, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. Sasha smiled and said that everything was exactly like that, and he had sent the puppy not long ago. Madame said with a smile that everything was correct, and the Duke also sent them a new piano. Madame looked closely at her daughter and asked if the Duke knew what her daughter had done. Adette sighed heavily and told her mother that he knew everything. Madame sadly said that she understood everything. Madame looked at her daughter with a smile on her face and said that she initially thought that the Duke was caring for their family because of the viola. Madame said with a smile that the estate workers told her that the Duke often came to see her. Adette. Looking at her mother, she said that it was all for business. Madame looked closely at her daughter and asked if she liked the Duke. Adette froze for a moment, not knowing what to answer. Madame asked her daughter if the Duke felt the same as she did. The young lady said with sadness in her voice that the Duke seemed to have never had such a thought. Adette was puzzled because she didn't even think that such words would make her feel cold. Madame looked at her daughter in surprise. She didn't know what to do. She was shocked, because she had previously thought that she did not want this and did not expect it. But still it was very painful for her. Madame quickly approached her daughter and said with sadness in her voice that she did not want to hurt her at all. Adette A was shocked because she realized that she liked the Duke much more than she had previously thought. Madame looked closely at her daughter and said that she should still thank the Dukes. The lady, in turn, was a little worried and puzzled, as she did not know what to write. After confessing her unrequited love, she could not calmly write him a letter. Adette understood that she could no longer come to him. Nodos looked at the young lady intently and asked if he should continue reading the report. She was taken aback and threw her thoughts away and said that he could continue. The young man looked closely at the young lady and said that he would like to tell her about the young man whom she had invited to the residence last time. She remembered the capable commoner who had helped her in many matters. Nodos S. said that he was informed that he had recently left those places and returned home. The young lady was surprised, and looking intently at her assistant, asked if the young man was not originally from those lands. He said that the inhabitants of the area had been questioned. They said that he looked like a wanderer. He asked the young lady if they should start looking for information about the young man. She sighed heavily and said that there was no need to look for him. But still, when he appeared, she would like to know about it. She knew that she should not waste her time on it at all. The young man said that he understood everything and also said that she had received an invitation from the palace. He asked what she would do with it. She was surprised, as she did not expect to receive another invitation. The young ladies were surprised and delighted as the Crown Princess's tea party was about to take place. The young ladies asked to choose an outfit in the most luxurious style. The young lady looked at her companion with a smile and said that she was very envious of her, since she had managed to get an invitation to the tea party. Adette said that she did not even know how she had managed to do this, since she did not even know the princess personally. She did not understand how the princess had found out about her and invited her. The lady smiled and said that she was also interested to know. The princess's maid stood quietly and listened to the conversation of the young ladies. A week later, there was a tea party in the royal palace. The maid looked closely at the young lady and greeted her. She said that she was the close servant of Her Highness the Crown Princess. Looking at the young lady, she said that the princess was waiting for her in the central garden. A moment later, they slowly walked into the garden. The maid looked closely at the princess and said that the young Viscountess Adette Bears had arrived for tea. According to all the rules of etiquette, the young lady greeted the princess and said that she was very glad to meet her. The princess looked at the young lady with a smirk and said that she had an elegant outfit. She told the young lady to raise her head. Adette, in turn, froze in surprise. She was stunned and surprised that they had the same outfits. Adette was in shock and could not understand how this could happen, since she had specially chosen the outfit, at him with smirks. Guessed? Adette looked closely at everyone present, as she now understood how everything happened. Adette understood perfectly well that she needed to get out of this situation immediately. She looked closely at the princess and said with a smile that, judging by her outfit, it had found its true owner. The princess looked at her closely and said that if you looked closely, they had the same dresses. She smiled and said that it was a great honor for her to be dressed like her. Everyone watched in silence. The princess looked closely at the young lady and said that she should come to her. The princess looked at one of the ladies and asked if she could move. Adette was in shock, as she felt like she had stolen the young lady's seat. The princess looked at the lady and asked if she had come to the marquise's last ball. She smiled and told the lady that she had heard a lot about her and wanted to see her. Adette was surprised, as she did not expect to hear something like that. They had a nice conversation for a while. Adette looked at the princess intently, as she was truly beautiful. The princess looked at the young lady in surprise and called her. Adette walked away and asked the princess for forgiveness. She said that the princess was so beautiful that she, without realizing it, was staring. The princess looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she was very honest. Everyone watched him closely. A moment later, the princess said with a grin that she really likes such people, because she is very honest. With the speed of lightning, the princess's face changed. The young lady, in turn, looked at the princess with bewilderment. A moment later, the princess's expression changed, and she looked at Adette with a beautiful smile. She smiled and said that she had heard that the young lady had paid a visit to the Kamash. Adette looked at the princess in confusion, as she did not understand what had just happened. A moment later, she said that it was true and she was there. But in turn, she was surprised, as she did not know who had told the princess about such a thing. She smiled and said that she had received an invitation from the Duke and was staying there for a couple of days. Everyone present was surprised and very envious of the young lady that she had been invited by the Duke himself. They asked if her sister was there. Adette S. said that, unfortunately, her sister was not there because she was not feeling well. The lady looked at Adette and said that there were rumors that young Lady Viola was sick because something happened between her and her friend. She asked Adette if these rumors were true. Adette was furious, because both the last question and this one she asked directly. She did not understand how one could be so consistently straightforward. She looked closely at everyone present and said that these rumors had nothing to do with the Duke. She smiled and said that if this were all true, she would not have received an invitation from the Duke. She said that the Duke also stated that he was not going to marry her sister. The young ladies perked up and looked at her and asked if it was true. They were surprised because they knew he had been out for a walk with her family and had even invited them to his property. Adette said with a smile that they were just talking about business. She knew that the standards of flirting in this world were a little different. The princess looked at the young lady and said that she worked very closely with the Duke regarding business. She sadly said that she had never visited the estate after becoming the crown princess. She looked closely at the young lady and said that she was very jealous of her. The lady looked at her and asked if it was really so that at the last ball she accepted the prince's escort, which was also closely connected with her business. Adette smiled and said that it was so. She looked at the young lady with a grin and said that she seemed to be very good-looking, since under the pretext of business, she was meeting with the best candidates for the role of groom. The princess looked at her maid with a satisfied smile. Adette P. looked at the young lady and said that she didn't know much about business, so she might have some questions and misunderstandings. She smiled and said to the lady that if she thought so, she could start her own business too. The lady smiled and asked why she would do that. She looked at Adette with a grin and said that her father does that. She said with a grin that she had completely forgotten that the Viscount had died. For this reason, the young lady had become the head of her family. She said that it must be very difficult for her. And probably the Viscountess was very worried about this. The knight looked closely at the princess and called her. He said that he had come for her. The princess stood up with the speed of lightning and, looking at the knight, asked if the time had already come. Adette looked closely at the knight. She knew that it was Elvange, as he ran after her little sister. The princess looked at everyone present and said with a smile that she had an urgent meeting due to a problem on the southern front, so she had to leave. They walked slowly back and had a casual conversation about what was happening in the south. They said that the knights would soon go to battle. The young lady said that this simply could not be, and she did not want to go to social balls without the Duke. The young lady looked into the distance as she saw a rather interesting spectacle. She noticed that in the distance, the prince and the Duke were fighting with swords. She looked at the Duke in surprise and froze in place, embarrassed. The young lady looked closely at her friend and said that they could come closer to the men since they now had a chance. The prince looked at the Duke closely and said that everything had gone smoothly thanks to the young lady, and the king signed before the princess knew about it. The Duke looked at the prince closely and asked if he was now satisfied. The prince said with a grin that he thought all this time he had not seen the young lady in a very good light. He smiled and said that she must definitely take part in their plan. But the Duke, in turn, categorically said that this would not happen. With the speed of lightning, he parried the prince's blow. The young lady watched the fight intently with admiration in her eyes. The prince looked at the Duke intently and said that he would certainly agree with him. And if he won, the Duke looked at the prince in surprise and asked where he was looking all the time. The prince smiled and cried out, calling the young Viscountess. The Duke turned around in surprise, looking at the young lady. Adette Z froze in place from surprise and embarrassment. She did not expect anyone to call her. A moment later, the prince struck the Duke with lightning speed, knocking the sword out of his hands. The prince said with a smile that he had won this time. He smiled and said that whatever it was, the battle could not be distracted. The Duke was dissatisfied but did not answer. The prince smiled and said that it seemed the tea party was over. Looking at his friend, he said that they could go and meet the young lady. The Duke looked at the prince in surprise and asked why he had called her. He said that they could just go about their business. The prince looked at his friend with a bowed grin and asked if he hadn't missed the young lady. The prince smiled and looked at the young lady and said that he was very glad to see her. Adette greeted the prince with a smile. He said that they could do without the greeting. He asked the young lady if she had received an invitation to the crown princess's tea party. She said that it was exactly like that. He smiled and said that it was very good. He asked if the princess had asked her anything. She looked closely at the prince and wondered if he had called her just because he was interested. Adette S. said that the princess had asked if she had come to Kamash. He looked at her in surprise and asked if that was all. He asked me if the other ladies had said anything. She knew she couldn't say they were jealous of the relationship between her family and the Duke. She sighed heavily and said that they had not said anything. She looked intently at the Duke. The prince asked with a sly smile if it was true. A moment later, a knight ran up to them and called out to the prince. The knight said that at a meeting of civil servants, a summons was adopted regarding the need to send the Duke to the southern front. The young people froze in shock and surprise. The prince jumped up in anger and, looking at the knight, asked what he was talking about. The young lady, in turn, looked at the Duke in confusion, wondering if he would really go to war. The prince shouted furiously that she was on the southern front. 6 orders of knights had already left. The knight said that the situation with defending the southern lands was getting worse and worse. An opinion was expressed about the management of the punitive detachment. The prince was shocked, as they were talking about a punitive detachment in a situation where it was unknown how many troops the enemy had. He looked closely at the knight and asked if he was really saying that the first commander was being sent to a place far from the capital. The prince was furious and could not understand who had made such a stupid decision. The young lady looked at everyone present, wondering if the princess was involved in all of this. She remembered the princess with a sly smile, saying that she had an urgent meeting regarding a problem on the southern front. A moment later, the young lady froze in place in surprise as she heard the princess calling her. The princess looked at the young lady with a grin and said that it seemed like she had not yet had time to leave. Adet Droja said that she was glad to meet her again. The prince looked closely at the princess and asked if all this was true. He asked if she had really decided to appoint the command of a punitive detachment on the southern front. The princess looked at the prince with a smile and said that everything was correct, although the final decision had not yet been made. She looked at the prince closely and asked with a smile if it was not the fastest and most reliable. She smiled and said that if the duke stood in the vanguard, many nobles would be at peace. The prince shouted that the duke must not leave the capital. He angrily asked the princess if she didn't know what it meant to be the first commander to leave the capital. She smiled and said that there were plenty of other knights in the capital. The young lady was shocked, as she knew perfectly well that the person who decided to send the duke to the battlefield was the crown princess. She said that many knightly orders had been sent, but if they sent his detachment, they would advance faster. The princess looked at the young lady with a grin and asked if she agreed. Adet looked at the princess in surprise, as she did not expect to hear such a question at all. She froze in shock and bewilderment, as she did not understand why the princess was asking her. The duke looked closely at the princess and said that if necessary, he would willingly go to war. The ladies froze in surprise. The duke looked closely at the princess and said that there were already enough knights on the southern front, and since the viscount was a man of great skill, they could rest easy. The princess looked at everyone present with fury and said that she had asked the young lady a question. The young lady, in turn, was taken aback. She did not understand why they were doing this to her. She knew that the crown princess had come to the tea party wearing the same outfit as her, and now she was asking her questions about politics. She was puzzled and wanted them to fight among themselves and not drag her into something like this. She knew perfectly well that she had no intention of taking anyone's side, but the fact that they wanted to send the duke to war hurt her deeply. She didn't want that at all. She said that, being the daughter of a viscount's family who had no position, she knew only this much about the country's affairs. Adet looked closely at the princess and said that war is the business of knights. In the capital, there are people drinking tea. They are under the protection of the knightly order. The young lady said that this was not a topic on which she could freely discuss. The princess froze in surprise. The duke, in turn, rushed to the young lady with lightning speed and called her. He was shocked by the words she said. In turn, the prince could hardly contain his laughter. She smiled, but in turn, she was very scared and wondered if she had said something wrong. She was puzzled and wondered if she had made a mistake. She said that in the capital, there were people who drank tea, and they were under the protection of the knightly order. She now realized that she was talking about the princess and her ilk. She was in shock, because she realized that she had screwed up. Trembling with fear, she asked the princess for forgiveness, but the princess only smirked, looking at the young lady. The duke looked at the princess intently and said that Adet Baducci was an entrepreneur and had little understanding of politics. He said that she had said this without realizing it, so the princess should forget about this incident and not listen to her. The princess turned around with lightning speed and said that of course she would not take her words to heart. The duke looked closely at the young lady and said that she had better go home too. She was to blame. She agreed with him. The prince approached the young lady with a smile and said that surprisingly she also had her weaknesses. Adet was furious and wondered if he was teasing her now. The prince looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she was wearing the same dress as the crown princess. She froze in place, but a moment later said that she was. He sighed heavily and said that he could tell what had happened at the tea party without looking. He looked at her intently and said softly that she must be very tired. The young lady was surprised. She did not expect to hear kind words from the prince. She looked at him intently and thanked him. The prince smiled, looking at his friend, and asked why he did not accompany the young lady. Cade stood quietly to the side and did not answer. The young lady looked in bewilderment in the direction the duke was looking. With the speed of lightning, the duke began to leave. He said that there was no need for that. He asked the young lady to be careful on the way. Adet froze in place in surprise, as she didn't expect such a thing from him. The maid looked closely at the young lady and asked if she had enjoyed her tea. Adet was very tired. She asked her maid not to talk to her. Camilla looked at the young lady with concern and asked what was wrong. Adet said, upset, that she would like to be alone. As she was leaving, the maid said that the young lady could call her at any moment and she would come quickly. Adet, in turn, agreed to be a maid. She lay quietly in bed and thought about what had happened. She recalled all the moments, and she remembered that Teehee Duke was looking intently at the crown princess. Adet was in shock and did not know what to do, because she was jealous of the one who was already married. She was upset because she understood that she could not even do anything. She told herself that she was just pathetic. The young man was riding in a carriage and reading a letter. His sister wrote that she was doing well, and she also wrote that she heard that he had been in fill-in not long ago. She asked if he was enjoying the trip. She wanted to know where he was now, as she missed him very much. He held the candle to the letter and saw that there was a message hidden there. She wrote that everything turned out the way her new mother wanted, and soon she would go to the kingdom. She hoped to see him before that day. He pressed the letter in his hand with fury. The knight looked at her intently and called out to him. He asked His Highness if he would return home now. He said that unfortunately he could not do this now. It was already too late, and they had to find another way. He looked closely at the knight and said that he did not call him here. He looked closely at the knight and said that he said that upon arrival in this kingdom he would be able to meet with the owner of the owl. The king said that everything was exactly like that. He knew that she was an aristocrat with a sense of responsibility. This was unexpected for him, since she was the owner of the fill-in. He knew she thought he was a commoner, and he wanted to leave things as they were. He walked slowly towards her as if he was curious to see if she would recognize him. Madame looked intently at the young viscountess and greeted her with a smile. Adette thanked the countess with a smile for her invitation. The countess said that she was very sorry that the misses could not come to this event, but at least the young lady came to greet. Adette knew that the countess was her mother's best friend, and she could not refuse her visit. She knew that since she was already remembered and her face was known, she had to leave carefully. A moment later, everyone present saw the young lady enter the hall. They said that she was trying very hard to gain the interest of Her Highness the Crown Princess. They were surprised and wondered if she was not on the prince's side. Adette was in shock. She was already tired of all the rumors. A moment later, the young lady called her. Adette was glad to see Lady Chevy. The lady looked closely at her friend and asked with a smile if she had a good time at the tea party. Adette looked at her friend closely and said with a smile that she had a very good time and that she really enjoyed it there. Everyone present looked at them closely. The lady looked closely at her friend and said excitedly that she heard that the dress she had chosen for her matched the dress of the crown princess. She said she felt so ashamed when she was told about it. Adette looked at her friend intently and said that it was nothing to worry about, since it just meant that she had great taste. She said the princess just smiled and did not focus on it. A moment later, the young lady turned around to see young Mr. Depin Elvonja. The lady was shocked and simply could not believe that the commander of the Second Knightly Order, Adette, came to her family's ball. In turn, she did not share her friend's enthusiasm. Adette was in shock because as soon as the young lady saw the man, she rushed towards him. She looked at the young man in surprise as he frowned as he looked in her direction. She looked around and wondered if he was really looking at her so unkindly now. She was excited and did not understand why he was looking at her like that. She was furious and thought that this was just some kind of absurdity. She wondered if she had done something wrong. She knew that there was a commotion in the royal family due to the departure to the south. She wondered if there were really only 2 orders of knights left free. She was very sad and wondered if the Duke was really going to fight. She knew that for this reason it would be difficult for them to see each other for some time. The young man came out onto the terrace. He looked at the young lady in surprise and said that he didn't know there was anyone there. He looked at her intently and asked with a smile if he could stay on the terrace for a while. The young lady, in turn, looked at the young man with embarrassment as he was handsome. She smiled and said that of course he could stay here as she was about to leave. He looked at her intently and said that they could stay here together. Adette looked at the young man in surprise and asked what he was talking about. He looked at her intently and asked with a friendly smile if there was any problem. Adette asked the young man if he was not originally from Viles. He looked at her in surprise and asked how she knew about it. He said that he thought he spoke Viles fluently. The young lady said that the department was not in the language of just a single man, and women should be careful when left alone. He looked at her in surprise and asked if this was really so. He apologized for his tactlessness. The young lady looked at the young man closely and said with a smile that everything was fine. But in turn, she was puzzled, as there were already rumors about her. She smiled and asked where he came from. The young man said that he came from Laot. The young lady stood quietly and eavesdropped on their conversation. She noticed that Adette very obsessed with men. The young lady looked at the young man closely and said with a smile that she had read about this city in books. She smiled and said that it was an ice kingdom located at the edge of the north. He smiled and looking at the young lady said that she seemed to know a lot. Adette said with a smile that she dreams of going there in old age. He smiled and said that he was very pleased to hear that. He said that he also enjoyed traveling. Adette looked at her companion with admiration and said that he had probably been to many countries. He smiled and said that of course it was, and also asked if she would like to hear the story of his journey. They stood on the terrace for a while and had a casual conversation. She looked closely at her companion and asked him what his impressions of the kingdom of Vilas were. The young man frowned and said that this country was simply amazing in its art. He said that there was a lot of beautiful architecture in the center, and there was also amazing music and art. But a moment later, his face changed, and he said that unfortunately, the border zone was completely different. The young lady looked at him in surprise. She looked at him intently and said that she heard the conflict there. It was getting worse. She looked at him intently and asked him excitedly if he knew how serious it was. The young man frowned and said sadly that he thought the lady would not be very pleased to hear about this. She said that it was all true, and she was a lady, but that was no reason to pretend that she didn't know what was going on in the kingdom she was born and raised in. The young man sighed heavily and said that this was his personal opinion. He looked into the distance and said that compared to other countries, the kingdom had a huge gap between rich and poor. He said with sorrow that this was especially evident in the southern border zone because it looked like a battlefield. The young lady froze in surprise. She did not expect to hear such a thing at all. He looked closely at everyone present in the hall and said that he was very surprised, since the royal capital was so different from the border area. He said with sorrow in his voice that it looked very alarming. The young lady, in turn, sighed heavily and said that everything was more serious than she thought. She looked at everyone present and said that they had gotten this daily life by exploiting others, and that it would probably continue that way forever. She said that if the lives of the estate's inhabitants and peasants were destroyed, the lives of the aristocrats could not be guaranteed. The young man looked at her in surprise, but a moment later he approached her and said with a smile that, after all, thanks to people like her, the kingdom will prosper. The young people said that the count was a very good man. He was a true nobleman who contributed to the country and sincerely cared about his possessions. The lady asked Madame how much time had passed since the young gentleman had passed away. She was puzzled, as she knew that it was an unfortunate fate. The young men looked intently at the young lady. The prince, in turn, wanted to know the cause of death. The duke sighed heavily and said that the cause was poisoning. The duke said that, according to the countess, he had been threatened before. Cade said that the count had raised an objection to the call-up to the southern front. He said with sorrow in his voice that it seemed the crown princess was involved. The prince was furious, as he knew that the princess intended to send him to the south by any means necessary. He exhaled heavily and said that in the end she was trying to isolate him. The duke looked closely at his friend and said that he should not worry so much. The duke said that without the king's approval, it would not be possible to send the first order of knights outside the capital. The prince sighed heavily and said that this was the reason he was worried. He knew that the Mad King was very fascinated by the young princess, and he could put his seal anywhere. The prince asked the duke if there was any news about the request for an audience with the crown princess. The young man said that the king's condition had recently worsened, so audiences with him were prohibited for some time. The prince looked at those present in surprise and asked if this was true. A moment later, he said that they should continue observing. The duke looked at the prince and said that a letter had arrived from Layot. The prince was very happy, as the day of the princess's arrival had already been set. He froze in surprise. The duke excitedly asked what was in the letter. The prince asked in surprise why the name of young Lady Bears was mentioned in the letter, and the duke froze in place in shock and surprise. The prince thought for a moment. He said that it was very surprising and noted that the young lady was a very useful girl. The duke looked at the prince in surprise and asked what the letter said. The prince said with a grin that Crown Prince Late P had asked him about a funny request. The prince said that the young lady was asked to appoint a servant and Princess Layot. The duke was surprised and did not know how the crown prince knew about the young lady. The prince sighed heavily and, lost in thought, said that he himself was interested. The most powerful heir to the throne of the kingdom of Layot, Crown Prince Hellas Layot, and his younger sister Princess Layot, she also promised to marry Prince Vishat. In order for this marriage to take place on the day of the crown princess's tea party, the prince took advantage of the crown princess's distraction and obtained the king's approval for the marriage proposal. He knew that it was enough for him to take advantage of the young lady, but suddenly the crown prince mentioned the young viscountess. The duke said angrily that this would not happen. The prince looked at the duke in surprise and asked what he had just said. The duke looked closely at the prince and said that it was customary to choose maids from counts' families and above. The prince said that this was not such a big problem. Cade said the young lady was different from the other embroidering ladies in the parlor. He said that she is very different because she is responsible for her family. The Duke said that it would be wrong for such a lady to work as a servant. The prince looked intently at his friend but said nothing. The Duke knew that if the young lady became a servant and entered the palace, everything would become even more dangerous. He knew that what had happened to the Count could happen again. He understood perfectly well that he had to prevent this. The Duke looked closely at the prince and said in all seriousness that many young ladies wish to work as servants. The Duke told the prince that he could choose a candidate from among them. The prince sighed heavily and called his friend. He said that even if he tried, he would not be able to change anything. The prince looked at his friend intently and said that she was about to go on an upcoming fox hunt. The crown princess invited the young lady. The young man looked at everyone present with a smile and said that this year's fox hunt was special. He looked closely at everyone present and said with a smile that to ensure the safety of the noble ladies, knights would also take part in this hunt. The young ladies looked at the knights intently as they looked simply superb. Adette S. heard the admiring conversations of the young ladies. But a moment later, she noticed the Duke. The Duke in turn looked intently at the young lady. She saw that they were looking at each other. The lady looked at the Countess and said with a smile that he had just looked at her. The young Countess looked at her friends with an embarrassed smile. The young man looked at everyone present with a smile and said that the crown princess would grant the winner of the fox hunt a wish. He smiled and said that for this reason they should all try their best. The young lady, in turn, glanced sideways at the princess. Adetta 5 remembered how the princess had said that if the Duke stood in the vanguard, then all the aristocrats would be calm. Adette P raised her hand and asked the princess if she would grant any wish. The princess frowned at the young lady as she was furious. But a moment later, she said with a smile, "Young lady, that of course she will fulfill any wish." The princess, with a feigned smile, said that she hoped that she would have a good result. The Duke, in turn, looked warily at the young ladies. The young lady looked intently at the young Viscountess and asked with a smile what wish she wanted to make. She said that it was useless to even try. Adette, in turn, knew that she absolutely had to win. Everyone looked closely at the princess and said that she would be the winner this year. A few minutes later, the horn sounded and the hunt began. The Duke looked closely at the young lady. He hoped that nothing would happen to her. The princess looked at the young lady and said that she seemed to be very popular among the gentlemen. Adette S. told the princess that this was not true, as rumors were always exaggerated. The countess looked closely at the young lady and said that she would not agree with him, since recently, at the banquet of the count's family, she had a very long conversation with an aristocrat. The young lady, in turn, was furious as she realized that the princess's maid had seen and heard everything again. The princess looked closely at the young lady and asked if it was true. She said that the young viscountess seemed to be very popular. She was surprised since the young lady was still not married. Adette Z froze in place in surprise, not knowing what to answer. The princess looked at the young lady with a bowed grin and asked if she already had someone in mind from whom she was waiting for courtship. The young lady froze for a moment and thought. In her thoughts, unexpectedly for her, the Duke appeared with a smile and a beautiful bouquet of flowers. A moment later, she told the princess that Z occupied a leading position in her family. She looked at her intently and said that, unfortunately, she did not have time to think about marriage. A moment later, the princess was shown the place where the prey was, and the princess rushed to the place with lightning speed. The young lady looked closely at her friend and said with a smile that she thought there were forests there. Adette. And she looked sideways at her friend and called to her. The young lady said she couldn't and told her friend to go ahead. Adette was very worried and confused. She didn't know what to do in this situation. A moment later, she saw a little fox cub run out of the bushes. She called out to her friend and asked for forgiveness as she had to catch the fox in the forest. The lady smiled and said that everything was fine, and she would definitely catch the fox in the forest. A moment later, she ran in the direction the fox was running. She hesitated for a moment as she didn't know where it had gone. She looked closely at the horse that had jumped off and saw it in the bushes in the forest. She reached out to it as if she already knew that she had caught it. But a moment later, a young man came out of the bushes and, looking at the young lady, asked if she had really been there all this time. He said that he had been looking for her. The young lady, in turn, froze in shock on the spot as she saw that the forest she so desired was running away from her. The young man looked at the young lady with anger and contempt and called her. Adette Z froze in place as she felt the evil aura emanating from the young master. Adette looked intently at the young man and said that if he was not in a hurry, then they could talk another time. He did not answer her. But a moment later, he looked at the young lady with a smirk and contempt and asked how her sister was doing. Adet Z froze in place when she heard that the conversation was about her sister. She knew that among the letters asking about the well-being of her mother and her sister, there was also a letter from the young gentleman. She was shocked when she sent dozens of letters to Viola. She looked closely at the young man and said that, as she had already answered earlier, her sister was doing well. She knew that a letter had come from the kingdom saying that their life was going well. He looked at her with fury and asked how she knew about this. He said that the young lady was not in their kingdom. Adet Z froze in horror on the spot. She was surprised. She did not know how he knew about this. She was confused, and with a trembling voice asked what he was talking about. He looked at her and asked with fury, did she really think that people really don't know anything? He rushed to her with lightning speed. She was in shock, because she realized that he was now talking about the disappearance of her sister. She wondered if everyone knew about it. He shouted that her sister was getting more attention than her. He looked at her intently and asked if this was not the reason they sent her abroad. The young lady froze in place in surprise and shock. She looked at him intently and asked where he heard about it. He shouted that the princess and the countess knew all about it. The young lady looked at him with fury, for she now raised the question of where such rumors had originated. She looked at him intently and said that what he had said earlier was not true. She said that without seeing him himself, he had already made similar claims. The young man shouted that it was she who was polluting the honor of the young lady Viola. The young lady froze in surprise. She was taken aback and, looking at the young man, wondered if he had really gone completely mad. He pounced on her furiously and asked if she really thought he didn't know about her plan. He shouted that there were rumors that she was comparing the prince and the duke. He shouted that she could have cheated on someone else, but not on him. The young man shouted that he knew everything from the day she brazenly got into business, despite the fact that she was a woman. He grabbed her clothes in anger. The young lady was very scared. Looking at the young man, she screamed that he should calm down. He looked at her with fury and hatred and with the speed of lightning pushed her away. He screamed that she should know her place. Adet was in shock because she realized that she was falling into some kind of hole. She was flying all the time and screaming. The young man looked intently at everyone present and said with a satisfied smile that the winner of this year's fox hunt was His Highness the Crown Princess. The princess, in turn, looked at everyone present with a satisfied smile and thanked them. She looked at everyone with a smile and said that dinner was ready, and she also asked if they would like to join in. The young lady, in turn, looked around intently in search of her friend. The Duke noticed her worried face. He slowly walked up to the young lady and called her. He looked at her intently, asked if she had not been with young Lady Burrs today. She sighed heavily and said that she was with her, but after she left her during the hunt, she never returned. Gertsinovskaya was on the spot from shock and surprise. A moment later, the Duke looked into the distance and saw a satisfied knight walking with a grin on his face. Watching the captain of the knights, he noticed that he went to the princess. He said something to the princess, and she looked at him with a satisfied grin. The Duke was furious as he realized that they were involved in something that the young lady did not have now. A moment later, he remembered what had happened to the Earl recently. With lightning speed, he turned and rushed to search for the young lady. The Countess slowly approached the Duke and called him excitedly. He turned around in bewilderment, not understanding who was calling him. The Countess looked at him intently and called out in embarrassment that he should not go. The Duke looked at the young lady in bewilderment and, asking for forgiveness, asked who she was. The Countess was shocked, since he did not know her. She said that she was the servant of Her Highness the Crown Princess. She looked at him intently and introduced herself. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise and said that he understood her. He asked if she had by any chance seen young Lady Adet. She was shocked because she now realized that, even without knowing her, he was calling her, calling the lady by name. She sighed heavily and said that she had not seen her. The Duke looked at him intently and said that he understood. She sighed heavily and said nervously that he could not go in search of the young Viscountess because he had come today to protect Her Highness. The Duke looked at her closely and said that she was completely right, but it was also his duty to protect the other ladies. He looked at the young lady with fury and said that if something happened here, he must definitely find the culprit. She froze in place in surprise as his aura pressed on her. Sitting in the hole, the young lady called for help, but it was all in vain. She was furious because she realized that it seemed like there was no one around. She knew that a lot of time had passed. and most likely everyone had already left. She was furious and cursed the young master. She knew that although he was a vile person, he would not do such a thing alone. She was furious because she understood that someone had definitely put him up to it. She even guessed who exactly it was, but she was still at a loss because she did not understand why they did it. Adette didn't understand what benefit they would get from spreading such a rumor. She thought for a moment about what the young man had said. He had said that she was comparing the prince and the duke. She didn't understand what was wrong with that, even if she had been doing it. She knew that she didn't need the prince for nothing. She was a little agitated as she realized that she had not been able to have a normal conversation with the duke lately. She was furious and did not understand why no one could leave her alone. The young lady was shocked and wondered what she had done wrong. She screamed furiously that she didn't even want to get married. She screamed that if things continued like this, she would simply be left at a dead end. She screamed that if they were going to subject her to a miserable death because of unexplained charges. That is, it didn't matter whether she died now or not. She was furious and shouted that now she would do what she wanted. A moment later, she froze in place as she heard a noise in the distance. A few minutes later, she heard the Duke's voice. Later, she saw him clearly. She screamed and called the Duke. Cade slowly walked closer to where she sat. He looked at the young lady and asked excitedly what had happened to her. He asked excitedly if she was injured anywhere. The young lady looked at the Duke intently and said with a soft smile that she was fine. He was puzzled as he did not understand how she could be okay with such swollen legs. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise as he assumed she was crying. She knew that since he had come for her now, everything was fine. Sometime later, they were riding back on horseback. He asked excitedly how she ended up in the hole. She said that she fell while chasing a fox. She thought that she shouldn't talk about what happened at all. He asked her if she had ever heard of a young lady winning a fox hunt. Cade said that the winner of this hunt was always the crown princess, and the promise to fulfill a wish was just an empty word. He turned around and asked if her wish was really that sincere. Cade said he was very interested in what she wished for. He asked if she would tell him. Adette said that she wanted to achieve victory through her own efforts. He said that in that case he would ask another question, if she knew about Leo. Adette said that she knew, since she read about him in books. Adette suddenly remembered the man they had spoken to. Cade was surprised. She smiled and said that she had seen the kingdom in books. He asked if she had ever met the crown prince. She looked at her companion in surprise and asked how she, being a viscountess, could meet a foreign prince. He said that she was right. The young lady asked excitedly if something had happened, called her again next time she could refuse, citing him. The young lady was surprised because not long ago he had been cold to her, and she could not utter a word. The young lady accidentally fell into the Duke's arms, unable to stay on her horse. The Duke, in turn, caught the young lady with lightning speed. She stood there embarrassed. The young lady looked at her friend with excitement and asked where she had been. Adette P. asked her friend for forgiveness. The Duchess, in turn, looked with fury at the Duke and the young lady. The Crown Prince looked closely at his wife and congratulated her on her victory with a smile. The young lady looked closely at the young men and said with a smile that they complimented each other. The princess looked closely at her husband and asked if he hadn't said that he had some interesting news. He smiled and said that his younger brother, the prince, had finally chosen a bride for himself. The princess froze in surprise and, looking at her husband, asked what he was talking about. The prince smiled and said that it was a wonderful event, since his younger brother was getting married. The young lady looked closely at the princess, as she could see that this news had shocked her. The princess smiled and, looking at her husband, asked what family his bride was from. The prince said that he had not told her about this. He looked closely at his wife and said that she was a princess from another kingdom. The princess was furious, as she now realized that the viscountess was only a distraction. Adette P. looked at the prince and congratulated him on the event. The prince smiled and said that the young lady had elegant manners. The princess looked at the young lady with anger and asked with a smile if she knew that the prince was getting married. The young lady looked at the princess intently, as she realized that she had misunderstood something. The young lady told the princess that she knew nothing about this at all, and that she too was now hearing about this situation for the first time. The prince smiled and asked his wife how the young lady could know if even he knew nothing. The princess told her husband with a smirk that the young lady had a close relationship with the prince and the duke. The young people looked closely at the royal family. The prince smiled and said that this was indeed very interesting, and that this elegant young lady was worthy of having such acquaintances.